this panel was organized by Progressive Victory and Brianna Wu. And Brianna has had COVID and got sicker again this morning, and she tested positive. So she has been incredible in leading the construction of this and a lot of the events that have happened this week leading up to this point, which may come up in this conversation. And so we're here to carry this on, this panel, but she's greatly missed. My name is Sam. I'm the project director of Progressive Victory, which Brianna and I have been working together on setting this up. And we're just really excited to bring together a bunch of the content creators who've been some of the most prominent voices on the left, the liberal left axis in the progressive content space, and have been coming together this week to meet with a lot of people in DC and the Baltimore area, and are coming now to this panel to talk about how we can come together and bridge divides to make an impact in politics, especially in the 2024 election. So I guess I'd love to just have you all go down the line and introduce yourselves and what type of content you usually produce.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Vigland. I'm the co-host of The Majority Report. We're a daily news show. We cover politics live every weekday at 12 Eastern. I co-host it with the legend that is Sam Cedar. He's pretty great. And I'm biased, but I think we're the best daily political talk show out there, just in terms of substance. When you're trying to look at things from the left, having guests on, it's sometimes a little boring, a little bit dry, but I think that wonky stuff is really important. The details are important. And yeah, if you haven't watched, I'd encourage everybody to check it out, The Majority Report.
Microphone. Forgive my unfamiliarity with microphones. I'm Vosh, and I go by Vosh, and I'm on the channel called Vosh, so I keep it nice and simple. And I talk politics, and I talk a lot of cultural and social issues too. I think they're very intertwined, and I think that what we've seen increasingly in the past few years, especially now more than ever, is that politics is a social issue in the sense that people's politics are derivative of the intimate personal problems they face in their day-to-day lives. So touching on those is incredibly helpful when it comes to reaching out to them and trying to convince them of a different perspective, and ignoring them is death knell. So that's what I try to focus on.
My name is, hello. Yeah. My name is Stephen Bunnell. My YouTube channel is called Destiny. A name that I picked up from my days of being a professional StarCraft 2 player that's kind of stuck around since then. I cover the news from kind of like a center-left to far-left perspective, depending on who you are, with a big focus on critical thought and scholarly analysis. I try to read a little bit past the headlines. I try to do a lot of research. Rather than reading about a case, we'll read the actual indictments. Rather than reading about a Supreme Court decision, we'll try to read the actual opinions from the judges. And I try to encourage people to hear people from different areas of the political spectrum without instantly assuming that they're evil or out to get them. And I try to encourage everybody to be reflective of their own beliefs so that they don't come at these political conversations with too much unneeded aggression. Just to start off the conversation, what is it that you think there's like a lot of wedges that are being driven right now, on the left, and what you think started that off and why it continues today?
Well, I think that, honestly, division on the left is not necessarily the worst thing sometimes. Like, people ask that question a lot, and I think it's just inherent to being on the left. Part of it's having principles. So the reason that the right is able to coalesce in ways that the left is not is, one, because they are also aligned behind capital in ways that the left is not. And it's pretty easy to regress to the mean for them and essentially just serve capitalism, and it's fine being nationalists or racist as long as you are protecting the power structure and the hierarchies that exist. When it comes to the left, there is infighting because a lot of people have principles, and they don't want to stand aside alongside certain things that are deemed unacceptable. Now, there are times when it goes too far, 100%. But I think that the fact that there's an adversarial relationship within the left adversarial is not the right word, but I think the fact that there are these open discussions and debates, that's actually a strength, and it means that we're thinking critically about issues, and I think that that's indicative of, kind of what we're trying to achieve today as well.
And it's worth noting, of course, that leftist infighting is left tradition. It's been happening for as long as the left has existed. It's seemingly unavoidable. It's tragic, but, it's like gravity. It just pulls us down, and there's only so much we can do about it. I think the key is understanding that through all the disagreement, fighting, and personal bickeries, there are things we can focus on to productively move forward. The key here is that it's a political space, not a social space. Disliking people in a social sense, thinking they are rude or boorish or even have some bad opinions, doesn't prevent you from working with them on issues of critical import. I think even like AOC at a national level has discussed efforts to work with Republican congressmen towards specific policy. And, they disagree on 99% of things, but if they work on the 1%, then, that's something. I only hope for a future in the online left where there's a little bit more constructivity behind all of it, because I feel like we're a bit lacking in that regard.
And let me just add one thing too. Like, the online left is not representative of the left, right? Like, we are. There's a tendency to overinflate our importance. We are not that important. We're just not. I'm here to communicate issues. I don't feel that we should think of ourselves that way, honestly. Like, I'm here to communicate issues. I want to bring people on my platform that are actually doing the work, that are on the ground, that are advocates. That's the role that I see in this political space. And so, yeah, there's infighting with media personalities, but that's mostly about branding and stuff like that. What matters really are the people that are doing the work and organizing and working together. And I just think it's important to make that distinction between influencers and speakers and people who have microphones versus people who maybe don't get the attention that they deserve.
I wish I brought a notebook with me because I think I disagree with almost every single thing that was just said. I think that infighting happens on the left and the right. I think it's silly to say that infighting is something that only happens on the left or is exclusive to the left. I mean, just a while ago, we saw a huge split with Steven Crowder fighting with the Daily Wire, for instance. We see huge schisms in the Republican Party with them being unsure of how they're going to proceed when 70 to 80% of the party is like ride or die for Donald Trump, who stands in stark contrast to the actual Republican establishment. The idea that, I mean, we see even Donald Trump, the guy who, is the leader of the Republican Party, literally fights with every single other person in the Republican Party and his own cabinet and his own attorney generals and every other part of his thing. So I don't think infighting is unique to any side. I agree that fighting and debate is good and having conversations is good, but I find that on the left, that's not what happens. And these fights don't originate out of principle, and they don't conduct themselves in a way that is productive. Instead, what they end up being is like an endless place to serve your own ego and to straw man, attack, cancel, destroy people that you end up disagreeing with. So while it would be really great if it did exist on the left where we could have conversations and disagreements, what actually happens is there is a party line that you kind of have to toe right now on the left if you're a progressive. And if you deviate in any way, size, shape, or form, you're essentially Hitler 2.0. And I don't think there's anything productive there. I don't think anything good happens there. And then on the end, the last point that Emma brought up, As much as I like to say, like 10 years ago, Twitter is not real life, I just sat across from Ro Khanna, who said that he didn't even have AOC's number, and they were conducting official business on Twitter DMs. So it seems like every day Twitter is becoming more and more like real life, where a lot of the policy, Donald Trump was literally announcing policy, making decisions from Twitter. We've got politicians like Bernie Sanders having to disavow his fan base because of their behavior on Twitter. And we've got a lot of interactions online that are merging more with real life than they ever had before. I don't think it's enough for influencers or entertainers to just throw their hands up and say, well, I just do entertainment. The work on the street is for the people on the street. I think that it is becoming increasingly more likely that people online are having a major influence on stuff that happens on the street or in academia or in other places. And I think we need to be aware of that responsibility, and we need to play into it accordingly.
I think I actually agree strongly with that last bit. There's a TikTok I saw from a creator called Chris Raygun. It was funny, but the gist of it was essentially he was calling out a number of other YouTubers who he strongly believed had received an email, like him, from a conservative organization offering them money in exchange for them being willing to push certain talking points. He didn't accept it. He feels that a bunch of other folks did. There is a really strong synchronicity there. It feels in a lot of right-leaning spaces where there is this underlying cohesion, and you spoke to it being like the bridge of capital, and I think that capital, if nothing, binds people. If you can pay people...
Money binds those right-wing influencers.
Oh, sure. Really obvious.
Left-leaning influencers make. I mean, like, it's not, none of us up here are poor, right? We all make a lot of money up here, right? I think some of the largest podcasts, I know the Majority Report does really good on Patreon, and I've watched your channel does good. Like, it's not like we're sitting up here broke, like we're on the street in rags, like, listen to a fellow leftist. Like, we make a lot of money.
No, but that's the difference, right? We make money, but the circuits through which we make money incentivize, in many cases, drama and infighting. One of the best ways to get a lot of money or prestige or clout as an influencer is to manufacture drama. That's the case for drama YouTubers, and it's the case for political YouTubers. And there's a critical difference between wealth acquired through that means and wealth that you receive from a different organization on the condition that you adhere to a certain set of values and not broach certain topics. And I think that difference, now that's not something we want to replicate, right? I'm not suggesting the solution for the left is to set up like dark money packs and start funding it.
But I think it's the same problem. I think the reason why we look at the right and we say, oh, well, they take money from PACs or organizations, so what is the bad thing about that? The bad thing is that you might have an influencer that's not representing their true, honest beliefs, but they're representing the people that are behind them financially. But I think the exact same type of audience capture happens on the left. Every one of us up here has made a decision about what topic to cover or not cover because we know that our audience might respond in a certain way for it. And when you literally have paying subscriptions that are riding on your opinion on like a certain breaking news topic, I don't think it's enough to say like, well, I'm funded by my audience, therefore I don't have to worry about audience capture, when I think all the exact same problems that people that are bought by corporate interests can exist on the right, the exact same thing can happen on the left with audience capture that want to hear a certain political opinion as well.
But it is a difference in how that capture takes place, don't you agree? Because if the capture is from your audience, the incentive there is to make the audience happy, whereas the incentive in the case of sort of other money would be to keep your benefactors happy, and they might have a much more structured and specific set of goals. If you're getting funded by a conservative PAC, they don't care about drama. Like, they're not interested in like a video that gets a bunch of views because you trash another conservative. They're trying to toe a line here, So we're not trying to replicate that. But I think that it takes a certain level of discipline in order to get comparable results in terms of audience engagement and cohesion. And to that extent, a lot of work needs to be done.
So I'm hearing a lot of conversation here about how the incentives in the space are lead toward conflict and confrontation, which I think any observer can see that is an angle, right? So the question I think before all of you is, given those incentives, how can there be any kind of cooperation between people who are incentivized to a certain extent by the way that the space works and the platform algorithms themselves to create conflict between one another?
I think that's certainly a good point. I mean, debates and things like that, but there's always an audience for that, right? And I don't know if you can get around that incentive except to just not engage in it in the same way. But debate and like mockery of certain people, I think, is justified. I enjoy, and I think it's actually worthwhile, mocking Steven Crowder, mocking Ben Shapiro, mocking Matt Walsh, Tim Pool. These people are worthy of derision. And it's important, I think, when an impressionable, like 15-year-old turns on their computer and Googles and maybe gets into some Andrew Tate or Tim Pool wormhole, that then the next video up on their algorithm is potentially me and Sam saying, this guy's a loser, like, and this is why. And getting a call. We are going to make evidentiary claims as to why that is the case, because like there are a lot of people who are feeling alienated, who want connection and seek it through the internet, and they get sucked into situations where they start to go down alt-right pipelines and things like that. So I think it's less about the undercutting the debate element, and more just directing it at the people who are doing the most harm in society.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I don't think anybody would have as much of a problem. I mean, some people will still argue over optics or whatever, but if all of the vitriol and ire were aimed at people like Steven Crowder or Tim Pool, I mean, I think people would complain probably a lot less, because I think a lot of people on the left feel that rightfully so, a lot of these guys deserve it. And a lot of those guys throw it at people at the left all the time too. You know, it's hard to be nice to conservatives when, you know, their largest TikTok accounts are obsessing over outing every single LGBT teacher as a groomer, right? I'm super empathetic towards bashing conservatives when they need it. I think the issue comes whenever there are these slight divides on the left, where these people, instead of being able to engage in critical conversation and defend our ideas in the ways that would, you know, be best to defend them, we end up just outing them and saying, we're not going to have these conversations anymore. We're not going to, we're above debating, you know, trans women in sports, or we're above debating whether or not all of white supremacy, you know, ruins all of society. We're above debating Roe v. Wade or any type of abortion or affirmative action. I think not only do we lose the ability to strengthen the arguments on these sides when we have to argue with people in the middle or people on the right, which normal people do have to contend with because we all live together, like it or not, we also lose the ability to kind of strengthen our own positions and have our own path forward where we're more research backed, we're more academically focused, we're being more honest with our arguments, because instead of actually testing the metal of any of our arguments and fortifying them and reinforcing them, we end up just outing somebody for simple disagreements. And I think we're seeing that, like, that has had, like, drastically horrible real-world impacts. I think of the University of Washington saying that they're not going to walk back a positive headline on a trans study because they think it'll look bad. Or I think of, like, all of the fighting that the left does, not to call out any particular people, but, like, with Jesse Singal, who writes a lot of articles about trans-related issues. Rather than people being able to engage with any of these issues honestly, with good arguments, and to, you know, reinforce arguments or attack the other side, it just instantly becomes an outing of whatever, you know, transphobic, ism, whatever you can call the other person, and then you just kind of move on and forget about it.
But Singal is transphobic, and the thing is that he can have liberal and progressive opinions on other things, but his opinions are transphobic. So you can make claims about individual opinions, and no one's saying, like, you're never allowed to vote Democrat again, Jesse. You're out of the club. But that those opinions and an over focus on the sister myth or things like that is a transphobic impulse. I think that it just makes people principled and clear-eyed.
So looking at somebody like Singal, how would we say that that's like a transphobic person? Somebody that clearly aligns with most left-leaning things, is clearly in favor of most forms of trans therapy. Is it because he takes a critical look at some research that we just write him off as transphobic?
Well, I don't think that I don't know. I don't think that the analysis of the sister myth from his end is in good faith. But I mean, I'm not here to debate Jesse Singal. He's like a myth. The fact that there's this overwhelming number of trans people who are desisting, and that doctors are pushing this onto people, I think that what you cover is just as important and what you choose to focus on is just as important as what you say. And he overemphasizes these case-by-case claims that undercut the solidarity that we should have with trans people.
So I can agree that it's important to focus on what you decide to cover. I think that can be as important as how you cover something. But I mean, at this point, Jesse's beat is essentially writing about trans-related issues. I find it unfortunate that on the left we've decided that if you take a critical look at trans stuff, which is, for better or for worse, been like the national discourse for the last 2 years because Republicans have no other platform, that we're not allowed to have somebody that focuses on, the reality that there are some people that desist. There are some people that get on these medications that maybe don't need to be. Instead of even being able to look at that, we say that type of focus is inappropriate. But if you want to talk about like police killing unarmed black men, regardless of what the numbers there, we can have a hyper fixation on that, such to the point that we even cover these stories in dramatically incorrect ways that leads to additional rioting or other downstream bad consequences.
The coverage is commensurate with the fact that black people are much more likely to be killed or abused by police, and that is why there is that emphasis. Trans people, 90% of kids, there's a study in pediatrics, 90% of kids after 5 years who socially transition continue with gender-affirming care. The very small amount who return to their birth gender or whatever that they were assigned at birth, that's like something like 3-ish%, and there's no real surgery involved there. That's usually kids under the age of 10 before hormone therapy has even started. So my coverage of trans issues is proportionate to the amount of kids that are actually transitioning and happy with their transition. For me, I think that that's my responsibility as opposed to focusing on edge cases, because I'm not a journalist in the same way that somebody writing for the Washington Post or the New York Times is. I'm somebody that is covering what I think is important, and its emphasis and the emphasis that I choose to focus on is hopefully aligned with the proportionality of the problem.
And I think that's super fair. And I would agree, and I would say the same thing. I don't generally cover a lot of desister stuff too. I don't even really like talking to desisters, which I think is fair for a variety of reasons.
Right.
But the issue here isn't what you choose to cover. The issue is deriding somebody else as transphobic because they want to cover it. And we can say until we're blue in the face that, oh, well, the data points in one direction, and like clearly all of these people are completely wrong. But then you look across Europe where they have stopped some of these trans treatments, and then you look at in the United States, there are some stories that come up that are questionable, and people in the United States, especially parents, will look at these stories and they'll go, okay, well, people on the left say that it's all fake. A whole bunch of people seem to be disagreeing, and the only people that want to have these conversations are people on the right. On the left, you can't even talk about it because people like you will say, oh, well, those people are transphobic.
So I think we've touched on something really important here, which is the difference between a willingness to critically examine a subject and engage with certain people on said subject. So I firmly believe that no topic should be off the table when it comes to debating or arguing or discussing its potential virtues. I think that that's always valid. I don't see this as much today, but there was a period of time during the prominence of the alt-right where you would, if you had any opinion online for any length of time, you would be thrown without your consent into a debate about race science. It's still to an extent true on Twitter these days, though thankfully it seems less so. Maybe it'll come back in style. I don't know. I think that when it comes to issues like race and criminology, well, I have a background in criminology. You have to get into it, right? On an academic level, you can't ignore it or turn your head from it. Lots of interesting stuff there. Valid conclusions to derive. But sometimes, when the folks who want to talk about it are very obviously and persistently acting in bad faith, the question is, to what extent can you engage? And that's the critical difference. I see lots of folks on the left who just plain don't want to talk about some subjects, and I think that's lazy. I think that if nothing else, they have to be engaged with in the abstract. And on the other hand, of course, there is a massive right-wing grift circuit of people who have been proven wrong 5,000 times on every conceivable issue. Like Ben Shapiro consistently gets owned on the same talking points regarding trans people, but he's been repeating the same ones for 7 years now, unchanging, not reflecting any shift in the national dialogue, because it doesn't matter whether or not he's been owned on them. So I think that this is actually core. This is critical to the difficulties in inter-left engagement, because the divide between what do we talk about and who do we talk to is really socially important, and it gets a lot of folks worked up.
Well, and I think that the emotion involved here is highly important to examine, right? You are all humans with emotions as you're having these debates, and you're reacting in the moment as you're talking live on camera, which is very unique for the type of content that you produce. And your audiences are also reacting live, right? So when people get involved in this and they start to identify with this, it can sometimes. How does that affect the tenor of the debate? So you can have these discussions, right? But how does the emotions getting involved in the audience?
Why would Arakara be after Karen Bloodhoof? Magatha could not be wrong. She is our most powerful shaman. Regardless, your great deed to the Horde shall not go unnoticed. Please, choose one of these as a reward for your aid.
starting to identify with these things start to affect the tenor of how that creates the relationships and affects the relationships between creators.
I'm not sure if I think my content's maybe a little bit different than what you guys do because I'm not a streamer in the technical sense, but we do have open IMs and open calls on the majority report. Or actually, you have to become a member and then you can IM, but you can call in no matter who you are. At least for me, and I'm still learning. Like it has made me a much, I think, more engaged, critical thinker having that audience interaction.
Yeah, I think that the emotional tenor is actually really critical because the debates and all the political engagement online by themselves, I think, inspire in your average audience member actually a really negative, like angry, almost nihilism, where they get so disconnected from the modes by which people engage in real political change that they just watch and consume a lot of content and get really upset. And that's one of the reasons why I've been so delighted to work with the Progressive Victory people.
Oh, great, love. That's very perfect.
Thank you. Didn't even plan it. I'll just say. So literally hundreds of times in emails, DMs, whatever, where you have people who, they watch the content, they like and they agree, but who could help themselves from feeling a little bit of despair considering the state of the world today? There's a lot to worry about, like legitimately, even for people with a lot of self-control. And I think a lot of that is amplified by the fact that they consume all this content and then they go to sleep. They have dinner, there's no outlet for it. You go and you canvas or do phone banking. And I think that for a lot of these folks, they feel a million times better because now they are part of a constructive solution. In fact, not just a solution, but in many cases, the solution, workable results are, if you really turn an election, if you work for something good, that's something you can point to on your deathbed. You keep that with you forever. That's a positivity that can't be eclipsed by any specific online debate or bad news article or whatever else. So channeling that, trying to push people towards that, hey, in addition to all this content, touch grass, I think that's great.
Yeah, I think online audiences make a lot of things worse. They have the potential to make some things better. Obviously, any minor disagreement you have with somebody, an online audience is going to amplify that a millionfold. Sometimes even if disagreements are non-existent, they'll amplify nothing into a millionfold. It makes people a lot more vitriolic, a lot more quick to anger, a lot more hyperbolic. I just described myself in 3 words on Twitter. Audiences can definitely amplify and cause a lot of negative stuff to happen online. Kind of piggybacking on the back of what Vosh said, I think the biggest problem with a lot of online political discourse is that the engagement starts and stops when you are on Twitter. That it feels like it's very hard for people to translate a lot of what they do online into some type of real political action. And I think on YouTube and on stream, I think we have probably the most engaged audiences of any media forum that exists today. More than television, more than talk radio, more than anything, our audiences will watch us for hours and hours every day, or tune into, the Majority Report every single day, and they follow us on Twitter and on other social medias. And I think that relationship, if we're going to take all the negatives of like people fighting online and the edutainment and everything else, if we're going to take all of that, we should also do some of the positives, which is mobilizing people to real world political activism.
Yeah, so you all have been involved in these debates for a long, long time. And you have histories with other people in the space and with each other. And that can, I think you're talking about how that can isolate. So, and yet you're all making the case that the audiences are engaged and want to get something done. So what does it take for you? What do you think the ingredients are that are necessary to still engage in this type of debates and content that you create, but also have constructive relationships to mobilize your audiences for better change?
Yeah, I guess it's more, that's kind of a question about like our personal psychology a little bit there. So, my therapist should be watching this, honestly. Yeah, I guess for me, I've had very few friends in the political online space. I have a few. Most of my social life is with like my friends from high school and college, and so I'm able to at least have.
By troll standards, you should be proud of your accomplishment this day. During your test of faith, you displayed strength of spirit, and now you have shown endurance in battle by taking on the rogue feather harpies. But the time has come for a new test. During the time of the old gods, elementals inhabited much of this world. They worshipped the old gods, and the gods, through their power, kept the elementals bound to this world. When the old gods were banished, the elementals faded from our world, and now only return at the bidding of powerful mages. There are exceptions, though. Some elementals were powerful enough to remain here on their own. One such elemental is Rokalim. To test your strength, find Rokalim in Thousand Needles and slay him.
Like an emotional outlet outside of anything that has to do with work, right? Where I can stand for what I believe in. I can do the best that I can to advocate for the policies that I believe in, and it doesn't become as personal, hopefully, for me. But I mean, it's an ongoing, thing you battle with, obviously.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's difficult all around, especially because when you're live streaming, you generally aren't going off a script. So there's a lot of like interplay there, both with perceived authenticity from the audience, and on your side, you're kind of, not to say that every live streamer is just like an open book or whatever, but there's definitely more of that there, I feel. I think that people want to go out and canvas and phone bank. I think people that want to feel productive, I think that it seems as though there are barriers. I know that a lot of my audience is relatively young and probably doesn't have that much experience with organized political action, which means that to them, going to a town hall or running for city council or whatever, it's like an abstract, unthinkable, it's archaic. It doesn't feel like something they have access to, when of course in reality they do. I told this anecdote quite recently, but it was recently found, I think there was just some look at it, but about 60% of the book bans in this country, like some folks getting mad, there was a gay kid in a book in a high school somewhere. About 60% of those done by 11 people. Just 11 people. They don't live in the county. They just call around. They're highly dedicated. They make significant changes. If you can sell people on the potential and the possibilities and actually going out there and doing something, absolutely critical. Also, it's a good social opportunity. Nobody goes outside anymore. Nobody makes friends. Everyone feels empty. Go on out there. I get a lot of emails, people saying they made some new friends while canvassing. That's sweet. I love that for them.
That's good advice, and I just want to piggyback on that because it is a good point. When you bring up those school boards, why the right this is where the left can learn a lesson here, why they're so effective at essentially having a very high floor for political engagement with their base is that they activate people on such visceral local levels. If you're going to your school board meeting to yell about genderqueer being in the library at your school and you're running for your school board, you're voting Republican in state races, you're voting Republican in federal races, you're organizing. Like, they understand how to make the politics so personal that in the end, like, your crazy uncle is screaming at a teacher or a superintendent as they drive out of the parking lot, right? Because they become so radicalized by what the right's project is. The left doesn't have like reactionary impulses that they can instill in their base to do the same thing, but that is something that we can improve on when you make politics personal to people's lives. They're much more likely to be activated in a variety of different ways. So in terms of my advice or something I'd like to see, that's something I think we share, Vosh.
I feel like it is astounding to me to think that the left doesn't produce that type of vitriolic reactionary behavior when we just came off of the largest riots in the history of like the entire United States with the whole BLM stuff. To say that we can't activate people on a local level is astounding to me. I think we absolutely did activate people on a local level. But the problem was that the influencers and the leaders in charge, instead of pointing towards good policy decisions, I think when it comes to being an influencer, being a voice, being a speaker, sometimes it becomes more of an exercise in ego, and then all the horrible things that come along with that, virtue signaling, infighting, excising people that we don't like, standing in front of big crowds, collecting a lot of money and doing nothing. We get all these people together, we get them riled up, we get them rioting, but then what are the policy aims behind it? Like, we have the same problem with Occupy Wall Street. What were the policy aims with that? There was nothing. Like, corporations aren't people in what, a tax sense? Like, it didn't even make sense. The same thing with the BLM stuff. Like, what were the policy goals after that? Some people, sad enough, actually tried to fight with certain policy goals. I remember 8 Can't Wait was one of those, and so many people on the left made fun of those people. They were like, oh, you can't, this 8 Can't Wait and blah, blah, blah. We need to abolish the police. We need to defund the police. Every place where they tried that, it basically failed and everything was reverted, like, in a year or two. I think that the left can activate people on a local level. I think they've done it. We all just watched them do it for, an entire season. of writing. I think the problem is we just don't point at effective policy goals, because I think really it relates back to the first question. It feels like sometimes when I look at people on the left that do online politics, it feels like it's an exercise in ego flexing and financial furthering and these types of like clout building activities, rather than what are the things that I can do to activate my audience to go to a local election and vote. You know, being anti-electoralism is not going to get your people to show up at the polls. Or what are some actionable policies that I can get my people to support, like banning trans books at a library? That's a lot easier to do than saying we need to usher in the new era of anti-capitalism, or we're not going to do anything until we have it's not even 15 an hour now, it's like 20 or 25 an hour that people push for. I feel like we're just so bad at having realistic aims for our policies, and then we're so bad at activating people on an electoral sense, because every single problem that we talk about is like the entire world. Like if you look at the right, you look at people like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson, what do they say? Go to the gym, clean your room, be misogynistic, okay? These are things that any young man can do, okay? Very easy, you can implement in every single part of your life. And then what are people on the left saying? Well, we have to fight against white supremacy, capitalism, and whatever other like grand narrative, anti-LGBT, like it's always these grand external problems that an individual can take absolutely no control of their life over. And I think that we need to do a better job at aiming people in realistic directions towards good evidence-backed policies.
Yeah, I think that it's an uphill walk towards that. I think it's easier when you're on the right, because the entire COVID pandemic situation can be boiled down to, execute Dr. Fauci. Like that's legitimately touted as some kind of like end goal for a lot of conservative commentators, or, arrest him or throw away the key. Whereas obviously any critical analysis of the situation and the actors involved is so complicated that no single individual could probably wrap their head around the whole thing. The trick is, and I agree with that fundamentally, about centering goals and being productive, because, some people have had criticisms of capitalism. I've heard rumors of this. But it is true that shouting that at folks doesn't give them much in the way of specific instruction. There are ways you can hit on concrete points, but they rarely feel as satisfying. And there's something about the I don't know if it's like a utopian impulse or something, but there is something. The right-wingers, in many cases it seems, they will hyper-fixate on very local, very specific stuff. Here is a teacher, they say, who wore a rainbow shirt to class, and people get worked up for this. They're screaming in the comment section, and this in many cases leads to harassment, doxing threats, spam threats, whatever else. This is content for them, but it's so specific. And then you go over on the left, and it's, here's video essay number 73 on like the history of Spanish anarchism and the actual reason why we can't decommodify housing. And it's good, I'll watch it, but it's not the same kind of content, and it doesn't lead to the same kinds of behavior.
Well, I agree with you. I think that it's a little inherent to the left, right? But at the same time, I think we can draw a distinction between the left in that way and the Democratic Party. And despite Biden's low approval ratings right now, it's something very unique that we're seeing. It's not tethered to how Democrats are doing in special elections or how they did in the midterms, where the Democrats overperformed. It's a very interesting thing, because normally if a president had that low approval ratings, the Democrats should have gotten smacked in the 2022 midterms, and they didn't. And why is that? Negative partisanship right now against Republicans is really damn high. People associate them with Trump, they associate them with chaos, and most crucially, they associate them with being the party that took away abortion rights. So when talking about issues that are as personal and as poignant for people in their own individual lives, abortion is number one. And I think finally some Democratic pollsters and consultants are getting the memo there, and 24 will be the election about abortion, and that's a glimmer of hope, at least for me, from an electoral perspective, that making that issue more personal could translate positively to polling. To the polling booths, I should say.
So you all are drawing a really strong distinction between organizing in the social space and organizing in the electoral space, and how a lot of people are being drawn to the anti-electoral fringes, and both on the right, and then we also have a lot of tankies that are coming up on the left. And so, how do you, as a content creator who's in this space, focus your audiences on remaining hopeful about electoral politics in the face of that?
I think that there's always going to be a distinction between these spaces, the social and the political, purely because people are looking for different things. You know, people wake up in the morning and they want to talk to a friend. They don't like wake up and I want to canvas. Have some stuff, but rewarding. Go do it. With regards to like how to control these, I think that, you know, things tilt in the wrong direction if you overemphasize the value of these. I think that the Democrats, like the institutional Democratic Party, has done a pretty poor job of cultural capture. I think that most of the cultural capture on the left is kind of this decentralized, like artists and, you know, community leaders. They have kind of built an orbit around them, and the Dems themselves just exist. Whereas the Republicans, it feels, have a fairly strong control over the shape that their associated spaces take. But on the other side of things, right, in terms of direct political action, you have an entirely different set of impulses. How do you get people to actually go out there and work? If you overemphasize the social, people treat it all like it's social. And all of a sudden, you don't want to do any electoral work because you don't personally like all the people involved in a given group. I see this at the DSA all the time. Yeah, I'll complain. I heard that one DSA recruiter was actually asking potential joiners whether or not they liked me as a disqualifying question. Now, I'm permitted to complain about that. Very silly. I'm slightly flattered, but altogether, I think that's perfectly endemic of the issue, right? Like, here's this social attribute. Are you worthy to be a political accomplice? If we can do a better job of cutting that and splitting that, I think that it would be infinitely easier to mobilize people towards electoralism without making them feel like they're slaves to Joe Biden, and we could get a lot more work done.
I think the balance is way too far on the activism side right now. I think people need to understand that if you don't vote, you don't matter. If you do not go out and actually vote at the end of the day for a politician, all of the tweets, all of the Facebook posts, all of the marches and the riots and the hanging out with the friends and whatever, none of that matters. At the end of the day,
Greetings. The test of strength is done. You have shown strength and bravery, and you are now prepared for the final test before these rites are completed. Your time with me is just about finished. I am knowledgeable, but the test of lore is not mine to give. There are lessons to be learned and places to visit that others claim domain over. If you are prepared, then seek out Braug Dimspirit. He is a shaman of great wisdom. He will test you further, so heed his words, adventurer. When you are ready, find the tunnel that connects the Stone Talon Mountains with Ashenvale. Braug dwells near there. And be careful, adventurer, the Night Elves may wish to impede your test.
day, more than appealing to a lobbyist, more than getting likes on a tweet, more than anything else, what a politician wants is to get reelected. And you can be the loudest, most retweeted person on the entire internet, but if at the end of the day, you or your group of friends or your generation or your particular block of voters doesn't show up to the polls, then at the end of the day, a politician is not crafting policies for you, and they shouldn't be. The goal of any politician is to appease their constituents and fight for reelection. And the way that they fight for reelection is by appeasing the voters that are actually showing up and going to the polls. So when you look around the United States, you're like, why do we still have 3 strike laws? Or why do we have cops busting down on marijuana so much? Or why is all this such bullshit? And then you go to the polls and you see a whole bunch of 75-year-old affluent white people. Oh, well, it's probably because they don't really care too much about what goes on in our jails because they're not getting arrested. That's just not in their purview. That's not part of their lives. So I agree that both sides are important. It's not enough just to vote. If you want to be politically active, then there is a value to the activism. There is a value to the retweets. There is a value to the YouTube videos. There's a value to everything that we participate in our day-to-day life as like political peoples. But if it's not connected at the end of the day to some sort of voting action, no amount of retweets are ever bringing back Roe v. Wade. Putting Trump in the White House is what got rid of it.
Yeah, I'll say that I think it's a little more complicated just because, yes, everybody should vote. And that is important, and vote Democrat. Because the other side, in primary...
Speak specifics.
In primaries, vote for the more, progressive person, and then when it comes time, vote Democrat. But, we do see the limits sometimes of like what politicians will respond to, and a lot of that has to do with interest groups. The biggest example is comprehensive gun control in this country. There's not an issue that any of us can all agree on in the United States of America, but universal background checks, things like that, it's like 92%. Bans on assault weapons is up there in the high 80s and things like that. And the thing is that those people are voting, right? And a lot of them are suburbanite moms, and that's a coveted group that politicians do covet and want to respond to.
Don't mind the thundering echoes off the mountain's walls. The goblins and gnomes are out among the flats, racing one another in atrocities created by what they call science. There are bigger threats here in Thousand Needles, one of which killed more than half my war party. But we remain here until we hear word from Belgrom in Orgrimmar. Until then, we hold our position here and stay vigilant. Seems Belgrom thinks those monsters are a threat. He wants them pushed back into whatever depths they crawled up out of. I guess killing the dwarves sent by the Explorers League wasn't enough. Now I have to send a half-dead war party into another battle. We won't be able to do it ourselves, not while we're in this condition. The dig site's to the south of here. There shouldn't be any more dwarves to deal with. Feel up to wielding a blade or staff and doing your part to aid us?
The problem in those instances, though, is that there are lobbying groups, there is corruption involved, and so it's not necessarily as, unfortunately in this country, we don't live in a direct democracy in the way that we should. Politicians have other people that they answer to, and that is a part of the broader fight
so many
against...
designs for our rocket car, so many, and I must try them all. I'm working on a new type of fuel, one that burns really, really, really hot. I haven't gotten the mixture perfect, but I think I know what I need. The scorpions who wander the shimmering flats have a venom with lots and lots of salt in it. It's very unique, and it's just what I need. Bring me venom, and trust me, our car will fly. My brother is working on a new fuel for his rocket car. He's brilliant, he really is. So brilliant that I think that new fuel he's designing is strong enough to eat right through the car's chassis. I want to reinforce its fuel tanks before that happens. The tortoises out in the flats have very hard shells. I want to use them to create new tanks for our rocket car. Tanks that can hold my brother's new fuel. You look responsible enough. Will you get me those shells?
Heh heh! With all the races they're running here, it's no surprise that a few mishaps happen along the way. If you look around the shimmering flats, then you'll see evidence of past crashes. Scraps of rocket car parts are littered everywhere. And those parts are worth money to the gnomes and goblins. They're always looking for more contraptions to slap onto their cars. So go out and get me parts. Bring me a heap and I'll pay you well. I make it my job to get people what they need, and the gnomes over there need a parts order filled. Their parts were shipped to Ratchet a week ago, but I haven't been able to make the trip. So, are you ready for some legwork? Go to Ratchet and give this parts order to Wharfmaster Dizzywig. He'll probably be at the docks. Do this for me and I'll have more jobs for you. Jobs, my friend, with serious profit potential. I have a package for an old customer of mine, a dwarf named Hemet Nessingwari. The package took weeks to arrive and Hemet's long gone by now. He said he was going to Stranglethorn to hunt the beasts there, but left me some money to send his delivery when I could. Hemet's a rich dwarf and it's a good idea to keep up relations with the rich ones, yeah? So, you want to deliver the package for me? I heard Hemet has a camp in Stranglethorn, north of Gromgul.
When it comes to racing, every bit counts. Whether it's a minor tweaking on the power output, a slight slackening on the tension coils, or lightening the weight of the frame, you have to take everything into account. We use vulture bones for a lot of the minor structural tweaks we make to our racers, which offer the perfect balance of strength and weight. Even better, it's easy for us to get more, as the salt flats are littered with vultures. Bring me some and I'll give you a good price on them.
After the big crash with the Goblins' Red Thunder Racer and a Basilisk, Kronkrider hired me on to take care of the track. I don't know what all the animals out on the flats are feeding on to grow so big, but we have to be careful to thin them out so they won't wander onto the track when a race is going on. Tell you what, if you want to go out and make a little profit, go out and remove the basilisks from the area. isn't ready yet. I can't cast that yet.
Runaway neoliberal capitalism, because it's important to cut down on the ability for industry to dominate politics in that way, so our democracy is just even a fraction more representative.
I think that when people talk about the special interest groups and the lobbying, I think that there are edge issues where they can have a big impact on. But when we talk about issues like gun control, I see this happen all the time when people talk about polling data. People will say things like, there's 92% for this particular thing. There's never 92% for support for anything in this country. That is absolutely not true. I think what happens is people will poll on a very broad issue like universal background checks. But then when you actually get into the weeds of what does that mean? Well, if you've ever had an antidepressant, are you forbidden from ever buying a gun? If you've ever had a certain type of criminal charge, or the red flag laws, or any of these other types of ways that you could potentially prohibit somebody from having a gun, you see support for those particular policies absolutely fall off a cliff. The exact same thing happened when we talked so much several years ago about universal health care. You polled people and you asked them, would you support the United States government providing every citizen with some form of free health care? I think that polled, I want to say, north of 80%. But when you replace that same question with, would you support the United States government replacing all private health care with their own, the support for that dropped to around 25%. And I think that sometimes we because we don't get very granular with our questions, we kind of delude ourselves into this world where we think there's broad American consensus around these certain political opinions, and it's not happening. Why? And then we look and we blame the lobbyists or the special interest groups. But the reality is it's very rare that we have broad consensus around anything today because we're so divided. I think if we look at Congress and we look at how ineffective they are, and we look at all the divides in this country, and we say, like, well, we want to blame capitalism, we want to blame neoliberalism, we want to blame Elon Musk or Jordan Peterson, but the reality is we are just historically incredibly divided right now, and I think that our government is accurately representing those divisions in our communities.
I think that there's some nuance to this. Consistently, we see that people tend to be a little bit more leftward when it comes to referendums than the politicians they actually vote for. Like in Kansas, for instance, the referendum to change their state constitution to allow for a ban on abortion did not pass, not even close, despite it being Kansas, full of folks who voted for Donald Trump, who pledged he would get rid of Roe v. Wade. I think that it's really difficult to sort of bridge that gap. The Democrats are proportionally unpopular considering their policies. And a lot of that has to do with cultural capture. I think a lot of it also has to do with capital. I think there's an excellent John Oliver segment on how a ton of local news in America is basically just all owned by the same company, and they reliably repeat, skewed talking points in a way that sometimes isn't entirely factually inaccurate, but definitely distorts the information. We see that in, national level too. CNN recently had a CEO change who just said he wanted to bring more right-leaning content into the network in order to sort of broaden the appeal. And unfortunately, judging by the articles that were written after that I read, broadening the network seemed to mean lying more, or at least being more wrong in implication. It's tough, right? Like, how do you actually get through all that? But if there's anything we can agree on, and I hope we do, because we're here with the fine folks of Progressive Victory, is that none of this matters if you don't vote. It is like having a nice classic car and then not changing the oil, wheels, or brakes when you need to. It is fundamental. It is the bedrock of everything you do on top of it. The most effective protests in the world would not do anything if they were supervised by far-right politicians. They would just kill or arrest all the people who did it. Stonewall, kill or arrest. Black Lives Matter, kill or arrest. Civil rights movement, kill or arrest. You need to have the right people in office, even for radical change to take effect, unless you're speaking to some kind of genuine revolutionary sentiment, which, good luck, I guess. It doesn't really seem to be the environment we live in right now. It doesn't seem to be a realistic venue for change at this time. I really think we should focus on the avenues we have before us.
Yeah, just to add something really quickly to that. One, I said this yesterday in our conversation, I believe at this point with Ro Khanna, when you're voting for Joe Biden, you're not voting for, like who you want to marry. This isn't The Bachelor. You're not voting, it's not a talent contest I know. It's not a personality contest. You're voting for the coalition he's going to bring into office. Like Lena Khan, for example, one of the best FTC chairs that we've had in a really long time. Just other other cabinet officials who are going to make change in ways that you don't really see immediately, but that are important structurally. Because when Republicans come in, they destroy, they gut, and it's much easier to destroy than it is to build back. And just to add to Vosh's point earlier, there are it's interesting for people that want to learn about politics. They're polling, and I guess this is also Destiny's point too, the polling on issues in a vacuum doesn't necessarily matter, because people can agree on things in polls, but there's a difference between what people agree on and what motivates them to vote. Like, for example, polling on stuff like trans issues, it's muddled, and sometimes, honestly, it's a little bit like the left is in the minority when you look at some of those polls. But we saw in the 2022 midterms that the people that ran on transphobia basically universally lost, because while people may say in a poll, like, I don't really want, a trans person in my girls' track meet, right? Are they going to go out and vote on that? Not really. And there's no evidence that's shown that. And so that's also why I don't even think it's a problem to back up trans people very vociferously, because I don't really think it has any electoral consequences, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I think you all are bringing up some good points. Destiny, you brought up the just how divided the country feels right now, and there's divisions that we all have been talking about on stage that are within the current Democratic Party coalition and without. The Republicans are setting a really good example right now of how the divisions are on full display over there, and they're so divided they can't even govern among themselves right now. But the winners of electoral politics, I think, as you said, Destiny, are the ones who actually vote and are able to get a coherent group together that actually are willing to vote and actually do the outreach. And so what is it that you are looking for in 2024 to make sure that you are directing your audiences in the way that is going to be productive for creating that coalition, creating that coherent group that's actually going to be the winners, as opposed to the divided losers?
I think it's important to understand at the end of the day what your goals are. If your goal is to just grow an audience or make a lot of money or grow your clout online, that's one thing. If your goal is to effect some positive political change, that's another. And to accomplish that effective political change, you have to be willing to work with other people and to have alliances. You have to be able to look at a person who disagrees with you on an aspect of white supremacy and not just label them racist. You have to be able to look at somebody who might disagree with you about desisters and not just label them transphobic. You have to be able to look at people that have slightly differing political opinions with you and not write them off as being, normatively just as bad as the entire opposite end of the political spectrum. So, generally, I try my best, obviously. Nobody's perfect, at least follow me. But I try when I'm reviewing other people's content to, be aware of hey, we might disagree on this, but we've got the same political ends, or hey, we disagree on this, but at the end of the day, remember who you're supposed to vote for, or I might not like this guy's opinion on these things, but we align with most things. I think that's probably been my biggest disappointing thing about most of the kind of online political left, is you can take a group of people, and, we had OkCupid political profiles. I think we'd be 80% plus lined up on most of our positions, but we fight we're part of former Yugoslavian nations trying to genocide each other. It's absolutely insane how similar some of the political beliefs could be, especially compared to our opposites, and then how vitriolic and deep the fighting is. Although, to be fair, without getting too deep into it, there are reasons why. There are psychological reasons why it hurts so much to disagree with somebody who's closer to you than farther from you. One of many reasons being that if a conservative walks up to you and a conservative says oh, you're a insert whatever, conservative insult against you, it doesn't really hurt because you don't really care what their opinion is of you. If you call me, this is being broadcast, I'm not in broadcast mode right now. There's a lot of bad things conservatives like to call you, okay? But at the end of the day, I don't really care what a conservative calls me. But if somebody on the left calls me racist or transphobic or whatever, these are things that in my mind, I don't view myself that way. A conservative insulting me because we're diametrically opposed on our beliefs is fine. I'll even laugh about it. I don't care. But when somebody that's supposed to be kind of in a political alliance with me is saying that I'm completely different, yeah, I think that those types of insults hurt a lot more. And I think that's why the infighting happens so much on the left and the right. It does as well online.
Yeah, this is a table of proud litcocks, okay? Can't take that from us. No, I think that it also speaks to the value of sort of multi-tiered organizations. It's pretty difficult, I think, for folks who interpersonally don't get along with each other to politically, work together, just for purely social reasons, It's a matter of willpower. Progressive victory makes it pretty easy for me to, for example, throw members of my audience at them. And I know that other folks are going there who maybe don't like them or me or whatever, but at least from what I've heard from the folks at Progressive Victory, it don't matter. When they're actually canvassing, phone banking or whatever, they're united in purpose. It works out great. Now, obviously, left infighting, I mean, everyone's experienced it if they've been in the left for any length of time. You see what it looks like. You know how vitriolic it can get. If you have participated in it to any extent, which I imagine a lot of us have, it can go so wrong so quickly. It's very bitter infighting and very purposeless too. Look, we can't fix people's brains, really. We can't socially correct everyone on the left magically, as nice as that would be. I think we can try to build ancillary spaces and communities, and we can try to shape our own communities to make them, if not perfect on this, at the very least, conditionally productive. And conditional productivity, I'll tell you, that's a lot better than most live streamers and YouTubers can do. That's a high bar, all right, for that particular space. I strongly encourage and invite anyone who does political YouTubing or live streaming to give it a shot, to expand outside the bounds of their audience, to try working with people with whom they don't necessarily agree. Not everyone, you can have standards or boundaries, but, we don't want to be insular because that's how we lose and they win.
Yeah, I guess I'm struck by, I feel as if we really just don't matter that much. As YouTube personalities or Twitch personalities, I think it's just we have to be vessels to get people politically organized. And at least how I feel is the guests that I have on my show. When we have on somebody who is works in I don't know, like Astra Taylor, for example, we have on regularly with the Debt Collective. She is actively making change, working with the Biden administration to try to get student debt canceled. And that original cancellation that he did, that eventually the Supreme Court got overturned, that's a direct result of what they did, what the Debt Collective and Astra Taylor did. Like that's, I guess, what I view my role as, is using the fact that some people like to hear my voice or hear me talk or watch our show as a way to platform other people who are making active change in society, and getting those organizations, Progressive Victory as well, to a place where they have relative prominence, given the small audience that I have, the small impact that I can make on the world in however long I am on this earth. That's what I see as the more productive way to conduct an online media leftist space.
I think, just as a quick comment, I feel like we do matter. I think we matter quite a bit. I think more than we give ourselves credit for. Like, you look at somebody like Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a billionaire, one of the wealthiest people on the planet. He still wanted more attention. He wanted to be president. He does everything for attention. You look at somebody like Andrew Tate, who most likely ran a sex trafficking ring for years and years, and it wasn't enough to have the tens of millions of dollars of Bugattis. He wanted to be a TikTok influencer. I think that at the end of the day, money buys power and influence, and people that have money eventually seek that influence. That's something that we found a way in the YouTube world to short circuit. We have that influence. And I think for as much as we care about people on the ground doing real work, so many of these people would kill if they could have even 1/10 of the voice that we have in terms of directing our audiences towards those types of real world causes. I think one of the biggest gravest sins that we've made kind of in liberal or left-leaning media over the past few decades has probably been Jon Stewart religiously adhering to this idea that I'm not here to inform people, I'm not here to educate people, I just do a political funny show that happens after, Muppets that crank calls on phones. He used to repeat that line so many times, and I used to think for so long, it's true. Why do people take Jon Stewart seriously? He's just a comedian guy. Why are you so mad that he's not pressing politicians or being more serious about his job? He's literally on Comedy Central. But then I look back and I think, how many millennials' sole source of political education came from The Daily Show? How many of you guys watched a lot of The Daily Show? I don't know what the age is. Okay. It's as silly as it is, as much as we call it edutainment, it's really important. We shape a lot of people's lives. We shape a lot of people's minds. We aim a lot of them in certain political ways. I think it's important that, I agree that at the end of the day, we're just talkers. But I don't want to make a Hitler analogy with Wash up here, but at the end of the day, like talking is a really important thing. Like you influence, you capture people's ears, hearts, minds, and you aim them in a certain political way. And I think that to do that in a responsible and effective way is probably one of the most important things that anybody can do in the world, especially an influencer.
Yeah. So
I aspire to your level of confidence, Destiny. Truly.
So I agree that the microphones you all hold are important, and at Progressive Victory, we're taking people from the streaming audience that are directed at us and mobilizing them for change. And it's been a great ride doing it so far, and we have big plans for 2024. If you want to get involved, you can go to progress.win and sign up. Jump into our Discord. We have a couple questions here, a couple minutes for questions, if anyone wants to take audience questions. We have audience questions that have been collected. Oh, never mind. Okay, one more thing. Okay, before we get to questions, I just want to say one more time thank you to Brianna Wu, who's sick right now and is just basically assembled this panel you see before you and has been such a moving force in organizing all the events that we're doing. And I'm so happy and proud to be working with her. I want to thank all the other influencers we have in the audience, and especially Kyla Turner for helping us put together and research these the questions that we asked these panelists today, and I really want to thank all the audience members for being here. All right, let's yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Hello.
Hello.
Howdy.
My name's Brendan, and I have one thing.
Yeah, let's just get the show started.
Okay. Hey now! It's your boy PSA Sitch here with another Sunday stream with everyone's favorite spectral investigator, Adam Brendan.
Oh, what's up? How's it going? I like that intro.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm all for investigating the spectral, whatever that is. And look, we're here with an amazing guest on the show. I love this guy's videos. What If Alt Hist is his channel. It's amazing. Everyone should check it out. And your name is Rudyard, right? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You're one of the few people to pronounce it correctly.
Okay, Rudyard,
Nice.
but Rudyard Kipling, I think, is who you're named after, right? That's like the famous Rudyard. But you're Rudyard Lynch, and Lynch is also, I mean, who doesn't love David Lynch, right? You got like the perfect name here. So, we were just talking a bit before the stream. I mean, if you want to just go into, like, the conversation started getting so interesting so quick. We were like, okay, we better just go live here.
So before the show, we were talking about how the CIA and the Soviets did various experiments in the spirit world during the Cold War, and they found some really interesting stuff. And what I was saying was that academia will take information that's not really valid and shove it into a pre-existing worldview. And then there's stuff that has much more evidence behind that just won't make it in. And the reason I said for that is that we confused what priest classes do with what scientists do. And every society has to have a priest class. You look over history, every society ever is religious. And so when you remove religion, you end up with it kind of seeping into a bunch of other places like fan culture. People treat Star Wars like a religion, into science, into politics, etc. And so an example of what's moral and what's factual, and they have to be kind of intertwined, because if you have a worldview that's like, you can't have a moral code that's completely separated from what the real world is. But for example, I believe war has to always happen. War is an inbuilt part of the natural order, where if societies don't have war, they grow weak and silly. But I don't think war is good. I'm not going to pretend that war is an amazing thing. And so there's that separation there of what's moral and what's true. And then we've removed that separation. And so you can't, when you're looking at the scientific truth, it gets conflated with what people want to believe. And then once those two need to be separate. And if you don't make them separate, they mess with each other. Where if the science isn't allowed to see the truth, it'll basically be corrupted. And what you end up with is people manipulating both for their own personal gain. And I think that's what we've done in our society, where we've basically created a religion around what gives people with college degrees the most power. And I think, I mean, this is
I use that thing.
The left. I think
Look,
the left is a religion based on giving people with college degrees more power.
Yeah, I use that. You said that in a video, and it really just clicked for me. And I mean, I think I have it in my notes somewhere. I have mentioned it more than once.
Yeah.
That theory that leftist politics is really just about empowering college graduates. I think it's this totally interesting idea. But just to go back to the war thing just for a second. Like, is there another means to do it? I mean, people often say politics is war by other means. Like, I would hope as the future goes on, we can find a way to maintain our strength as a culture without actually, engaging in tribal warfare.
It depends on what time frame you're looking at. And for me, because my speciality is history, I look at things over thousands of years. And over that perspective, there's no way in hell we don't have a war. However, you can look at periods of like 100 years or 200 years, and there's not a war. And the only time in history where you don't have major wars is because one great power is strong enough that it's capable of making war uneconomical for everyone else involved. So the Romans, the British, etc.
The Americans, let's be clear here.
And interestingly, over the 20th century, we've seen alternatives to war, where the fall of the Soviet Union, decolonization, and the reason most people get scared of war is by how traumatic the world wars were. Because when people predict the future, they always go back to the last alternative and think it's the next thing. But because the end point of the world wars was that millions of people died, the European continent got fried, we nearly had a nuclear holocaust, but I don't think that has to be the future of war. And so what I've said in my videos is I think that if we have a major war, it'll be a decentralized, more limited war and that sort of thing. It's not the horrible world wars that can wipe out a society in 4 years. It's more something where, like, for example, in the 1700s, you could trade with or go on vacation to a country you were at war with. And that's a completely different. Yeah, for real. Like, people were.
That's crazy.
And back in the 1700s, people would literally have dinner with the opposing army before the battle because they were all gentlemen and it wasn't personal.
Wow. Okay. That's kind of crazy.
And so when people think of war, there's only 2 eras of history that have these giant, like, empire breaking periods. And that's something that we don't really think about today, because when we think war, our first thought is nuclear Armageddon.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's so another thing that we talked about before the stream started, which I think people will be interested in, is I was saying that I think we have a lot of overlap in our book selections. We mentioned The Righteous Mind. You had said quite equivocally that The Righteous Mind had changed your life. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I really loved The Righteous Mind, and it really changed how I viewed the world. And the reason, for those that haven't read it, and I really want to bring John Haidt in my podcast, what John Haidt does is he studies the psychology of politics, where he goes through that there are these 6 pillars that all societies have to differing degrees, and they're ingrained in our biology based off certain biological self-interests. And these include liberty, harm, fairness, equality, authority, and purity. And different parts of the political spectrum pull on them. And human nature is 90% irrational and about 10% irrational. And we choose different irrational points to start from. And then we use rationality or rationalizations to justify where we end up. And that really changed how I viewed the world, because beforehand you have this idea that the right and the left are these, you didn't really have a frame of reference to understand why they were different and what they were really about. And that was a big turning point for me, because you could suddenly see the architecture behind these different beliefs. And also I could compare it to other historic societies, because you can go back and compare certain political views to pre-industrial religions. And that was really a big turning point for me because I was able to I was able to kind of deconstruct the worldview of both the right and the left on a more on a more clinical basis.
Right. Do you are you familiar with?
I actually want to ask you about this because I want to ask you, how do you define the right versus the left? And have you seen Haidt's kind of right-left moral foundations breakdown in history? Or is it like a recent thing?
Interesting.
Oh, great question.
Sorry about the background noise. My neighbor's mowing his lawn.
We can't hear any of it. Zoom actually cuts a lot of that stuff out.
That's incredible.
So, it sounds great.
I was worried about that, but
sounds awesome.
So these things, the right and the left today they're broad coalitions that don't really have a shared. They're not like back in Stalinism, where in Stalin's Russia, everyone believed the exact same thing, and if you didn't, you were shot. Where the right and the left are broad coalitions that don't really share that much. I see the left as a descendant of Gnosticism, and that's kind of this kind of schizo rabbit hole that I've seen a couple other people fall down, where Gnosticism was this ancient religion from the Middle East, and it was kind of its own thing, but it would latch on to Judaism or Christianity or Islam or other religions. And it's kind of like if you split Christianity and Buddhism, where Gnostics believe that the world is an evil conspiracy by the devil. And for people listening in the audience, wait till the end. I know this is going to sound weird, but suspend disbelief for about a minute. Where Gnostics believe that the earth is inherently evil and the world is an evil conspiracy by Satan to basically torture souls. And then there is this secret God that gives people this hidden knowledge, and that the people with the hidden knowledge can realize that they can become gods and then break the evil conspiracy. And this was a very common belief, but it wasn't able to gain widespread adherence among the majority population. And so it kind of bumped around in secret associations. And it was big in the Middle Ages because this was a very religious society where every educated person knew religious philosophy. And then it was big in the early modern period. And then Hegel, these people would use certain terminology to make others aware that you were a Gnostic. And Hegel used a lot of this terminology, and Marx based it off Hegel. But if you look at the left today, people study people's beliefs at face value and not realize what is this belief getting and what is the underlying worldview. And for the left, their underlying worldview is everything is an evil conspiracy that we have to deconstruct. And we are the people with the hidden knowledge. And thus anyone who disagrees with us has to either be evil or stupid. And this is one of the things I see with the left. The right is capable of believing that its opponents are just misguided or are people who are intelligent with different upbringings that came to different conclusions. And so if you also look at the left, they believe the second that they win, the world will become a utopia. And that belief structure only makes sense from a Gnostic framework because the Gnostics believe the world's an evil conspiracy. And once you remove that, you'll be living in a utopia. And so the left, I don't think the people involved knew what they were doing. These were ideas that were kind of in circulation. And over time, they evolved into it because these are ideas that are very psychologically palatable. And so one of the things with John Haidt is that the left has 2 or 3 psychological foundations. They care a lot about harm. They care a lot about liberty. And then they've recently become obsessed with purity. And it's funny that the radical left is the most obsessed with purity of any population in America, or maybe even the world. It wouldn't surprise me if woke people are more puritanical than the Taliban, if I'm honest.
I don't disagree.
One of my buddies was captured by the Taliban, and he lived with them for 6 months. And it was ironic where, having spoken to him, I would legitimately say that there are ways where woke people are more puritanical than the Taliban. But the thing is that with the left, they come from this worldview where everything is an evil conspiracy. And that's just not the reality. I'm sorry, this is taking a long for me to explain, but the reality of the world is everyone is struggling for survival against a bunch of other groups, and people always try to find edges over other groups. Where, for example, from the left's perspective, men oppress women because men are brutal. However, if you look over the entire course of history, if men could have gotten a strategic edge by giving women, like by basically doing feminism 1,000 years ago, you would have seen feminism 1,000 years ago. And so the left doesn't see the world through any lens of practicality, which leads me back to them having a worldview that stems from Gnosticism.
It seems like the right has adopted in a lot of respects the everything is a conspircy now too, because it's like everything's the deep state.
Yeah, it's sad actually, because I predicted the right going off the rails a little bit ago, and we were talking at the tweet I released before, where I put out a tweet saying we're about a year away from someone on the right saying I'm unironically a fascist, and then having all the comments be based. And then the tweet went viral. It got 750,000 views. And all the comments are based, I am unironically a fascist. And
we're already there.
It makes me sad because I'm a classical liberal. And I built a lot of my identity around that. And I love freedom and democracy and all that stuff. And I saw this coming. I talked about it, and then it just kind of happened. And what happens because people feel so disempowered today because they're broke, they're depressed, they're lonely, they look for conspiracy theories to explain it. And I'm kind of scared to see where the right's going to go. And the right also does have, like, Nazism's also a descendant of Gnosticism. And the reason that both the far right and the far left kind of get that conspiracy worldview is because once you remove traditional religion, you remove any sense that the world has order. And so once you lose the sense of order, you kind of jumped, like the next easy psychological jump is that everything's an evil conspiracy. And where I see the right going, the thing that scares me the most at where the right is going is the lack of empathy. Because for a lot of the right today, if you suggest, like, hey, can we please be a little bit kinder about this? Can we please not go full barbarian? People will call you a cuck. And the left boy who calls wolves the right, where I saw this for like 10 years. I was thinking about this, where the left the left's dominant strategy is baiting into hazard, or basically annoying people so much they do something dumb. And I think that's probably the left's strategy, where they're trying to basically bait the right. They're master baiters. They're trying to bait the right into doing something crazy, but they don't seem to understand that the right's military power, the right controls all force in America. The right has the military, it has the police, it has the gun owners, it has the resources, the internal transportation. And so I think things are going to get ugly, and I'm scared, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it seems like the left kind of has been crying wolf for a long time about racism, sexism, so that when the actual racists and sexists show up, it's kind of like, oh, they're probably lying. And it was the same thing with the right, kind of cried wolf about socialism. And now that the actual socialists are here, it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to listen to you anymore.
And it's funny. I think a lot of socialists are better served on the right than the left at this point. Because one of my friends said, there are loads of people on the MAGA right who would have positions that are identical to that of a member of the American Communist Party in the
Jackson Henkel.
Big corporations are terrible. The rich are grinding us into the dirt. The giant multinational corporations are destroying our culture. And I've had this debate with my father for like 5 years, where we were talking about, is the right or the left basically an unconscious vortex that acts on its own, or is it run by a small cabal? And the conclusion I've come to is it's both at the same time, and that the small cabal is in competition with the social justice vortex. And I think over the last couple of years, with the left has become more corporate, and so you're seeing a lot of these choices made by the top cabal. And then because of that, the right has been able to become more populist. And at this point, I don't really see the American right having any real identity. It's just people who aren't part of the left.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me give you.
I just want to ask on the fascism conspiracy brain thing. You mentioned that you thought it was economically driven. I think a lot of people, obviously they call it the culture war. They think it's philosophically driven. But I'm often torn. I think the philosophy and the economic conditions are intertwined to some respect. Obviously, how you conceptualize your economic conditions, philosophy can help make better or worse. But I do think a lot of it ultimately has to be driven by economics. What is your take?
I definitely agree. I mean, everything's everything. It's why I make 40-minute video essays. If the answers were easier, my videos would just be people are poor and they're angry. Done.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
But I mean, history comes and goes like an ocean current. And when the storm smashes up against the beach, when the waters are ready, there's a lot of random flotsam and stuff from further out that get washed up. And we can actually predict when societies have revolutions through economic data. So the underlying driver is economic. And there's this really cool data scientist named Peter Turchin who has a computer model that his stuff's amazing. He's been able to predict the Russian Civil War, the French Revolution, the fall of Rome, the fall of the Roman Republic, the Black Death.
You're talking about elite overproduction, right?
Exactly, yeah. Where he controls for 3 variables: inequality, average wages, and elite overproduction, which is basically people trying to get into good jobs. And using those 3 variables, plugging it over history, he's been able to predict when countries have revolutions and civil wars. And so in 2010, he said that we would have that in 2020. And so I don't think most Americans realize how rough. I mean, the lives of Americans economically are rough, but I think it's compounded by a bunch of other stuff like the breakdown in community, religion, shared culture, etc., where people aren't starving, but because we've removed those shared things, people don't have to be starving to have a revolution. And I think the economics is pushing this to breaking point, and then there's a bunch of other variables that make it worse in different ways.
Yeah, I know you're a James Lindsay fan. James Lindsay did a podcast on this elite overproduction thing, and it was before I had encountered Turchin's
I didn't know Lindsay talked about that. I just got it from Turchin.
Look, I DM'd Lindsay, and Lindsay hadn't read Turchin either. He just came up with it on his own. But Lindsay was in the PhD program, and he could see the elite overproduction like firsthand. So he did this podcast. It was just such a black pill. I was like, all these kids are getting all of these PhD degrees, and there's absolutely no place in society for them. They're gonna be revolutionaries. It's impossible for them not to be.
I saw that at age 22. I mean, I'm age 22, and when I went to high school, I didn't know how to explain this stuff, but I could intuitively pick up on a lot of it just looking at people's lives. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, which is part of the Rust Belt, and so that adds another degree of desperation to things. But I'd see people working really hard in high school, and I didn't really do that. I was kind of an edgelord in high school, and I didn't try that hard.
Based. Way to be. Smoking weed in the bushes.
Yeah. But I saw these kids, and I thought, you guys are working, because for a lot of them, they were working like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing various stuff. It's like China level things. I remember seeing a girl break down in tears when she had an hour free in senior year because she didn't know what to do with that. And having an hour free was an existential crisis. So I was thinking to myself, and I heard all these stories of people out of college. You guys are working super hard, and I know there's not a payoff at the end. So why are you guys doing this? And I worked hard on, I remember I had a calculation my senior year of high school. I'm not going to be successful in the conventional route. And I developed 5 different things I could try to do as an entrepreneur because I knew I wouldn't make it on the conventional route. But I think there's this like awakening black pill among the population, especially people in my age, that they're just screwed on a bunch of different things, whether economically, dating, socially,
Oh yeah, dating is a whole nother. Oh man.
I actually think the dating. I call it the dating and the marriage crisis is the #1 revolution driver today. I think it's more than economics, actually.
Yeah, it's
Maybe.
tough. Go ahead, Sitch. What you
Well,
got?
was being on YouTube one of your plans, or did that
I
use?
didn't expect it. It kind of just happened. I never planned on being on YouTube because being a YouTube public intellectual wasn't even a career when I was in high school.
Yeah,
Right.
And I remember I was rewatching iCarly and I was looking at iCarly's live stream stats, and I thought that I saw that and I thought this girl in 2010 is supposed to be one of the top content creators. She would not be able to live off those stats today. And so that's just how fast the internet grew. And what happened was that I was stuck at home during COVID during my gap year, and I was just bored out of my mind. And I had around 60,000 subscribers, and I was still doing alternate history back then, like what if the South won the Civil War, or what if the Nazis won World War II? And I just worked on my channel full time when I was stuck at home during COVID. Then I went to college, and my channel really took off when my first semester of college, and I was making enough money that I didn't really have. I just looked at one of my checks in December of freshman year, and I thought I can't stay in school, and I was working myself to death where I do my classwork and then I do my full-time YouTube job, and I wasn't an alcoholic, but I was drinking more than I liked to basically calm my nerves, and so and then I met one of my friends who was a digital nomad living in Mexico. And then he basically said, "Hey, Rudyard, do you want to drop out of school and move to Mexico with me?" And so I did that. And I didn't decide to be a YouTuber until it was just my job already.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so you said a lot of things that I think are very true. Conspiracies bred out of a lack of order in people's lives. And let's see. And that the lack of religion has led to faith bleeding into science. And also, I'm assuming you mean like also when kind of wokeness has become its own religion as well. But I want to go back to the beginning. You said that you were doing a bunch of reading on the CIA and Russia's experiments into the spirit world, which interests me a lot.
This is a rabbit hole that I've been stuck on for a long time. And I'm going to end up making like 10 videos about it. But I'm kind of obsessive with how I make videos where I don't feel I've done a good enough job unless I've read like 10 books on the topic.
That's
so
good. Yeah.
I've been studying this topic a lot, and the CIA did these studies in the 60s and the 70s where they'd play sound frequencies and then have people lie in bed or lie down, and they were consistently able to find that people would astral project out of their body, and they were able to get evidence for.
Wait, this has been documented?
Yeah, the CIA was doing this for 15 years, and then the report on it was all the science is correct for this. We just
but like this is an official CIA report. It says like we were able to get people to astral project on command.
Yeah, this is look at the Gateway report, and then the military.
You doubt that, Sitch?
I'm just shocked.
Yeah, it's called Gateway, and it's all public data. It was released in 2016.
Nice.
And then the military's report was all the science in the Gateway project was correct. Just they didn't have enough people in the field to validate it. Where they ran through a couple different kinds of biometric. They had like 3 or 4 different scientific ways of analyzing what was going on at the time, where they could astral project out of their bodies, and they could go to the neighbor's house, see what the neighbor is doing at a certain time, ask the neighbor about details of it, and they were able to get data that was correct enough that they weren't making it up. They could read numbers on the other side of the room, or the other side of the country in a certain room. But the problem was the further you get out, the more your mind messes with this. So they could read a number, like they'd have a room on the other side of the country, and then people would use their minds to basically read the numbers. And enough of the numbers were correct that they knew they weren't making it up. But at the same time, it wasn't enough that it was perfect. And what they found is the further you get out into the spirit world, the more it doesn't relate to what's actually going on in the physical world. The more your ideas and mindset and your own psychological state mixes with it. And what the Soviets also did in the Czech Republic at the exact same time, and you got to love the Soviets for stuff like this, is they gave 4,000 people giant amounts of LSD over extended periods of time and then interviewed them. And what they found was a like for Dante's Inferno, the further you get out from Dante, the weirder hell gets. And this was a concept in the pre-industrial mystic traditions that because back in pre-industrial societies, they didn't have a concept of splitting off the psychological world and the physical world. So if you do these weird spirit quests, they just thought that was outer space, and you were going into physical outer space. And so basically, the further out, and for both the Gateway and the Soviet ones in Czechia, there's this kind of map where the further you get out, the more abstract it is, where you'll talk to like a god. Then beyond that is the incredible unknown. And it's more degrees of abstraction and difficulty to understand. And I don't fully buy all of this. I mean, whenever you find new stuff, a lot of it turns out to be wrong in retrospect. But the thing that makes me kind of wink at it is that literally every other society in history believed in this stuff. And we, in the modern world, are the weird ones out. And our reason for not believing it is just that we can't document it. And we have records of in ancient India, the priest classes would take psychedelics, or they would meditate, and then they also built a mental model that's exactly the same as what these two experiments are talking about. And you also have a similar tradition in pre-modern Europe, where the priest classes of all these ancient societies would go on, they would have these encounters with the spirit world. And this is something that we hide in modern Christianity, but like Isaac Newton was obsessed with this stuff. He studied the esoteric as nearly as much as he studied physics. The founding fathers were steeped in this stuff, and so a lot of the choices for like the currency are esoteric symbols to further the republic, because the Freemasons were talking about this stuff. And I think that there's a theory of the world here that we haven't really locked onto that needs serious study. And I don't know, when I make videos like this, I'm assuming a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is bullshit, but I think someone should at least talk about it.
Well, it's crazy. So if the CIA was able to replicate with some consistency that people could project and they would get, I don't know, 50, 60% accuracy on some of the stuff. I mean, it's just wild to me that that wasn't taken seriously and is not being researched outside of, some top secret lab somewhere. I mean, unless it is all being researched just secretly. I don't understand how that could just fall into the cracks.
The thing is, it doesn't fit with the modernist worldview well enough, where it makes me think of back in the Middle Ages, they would find fossilized sea animals in the middle of the land. Like in the middle of the continent, you'd find a fossilized seashell or a dinosaur. And what the medieval Catholic Church said was that these were aberrations designed by God to test our faith in him.
Right.
And in retrospect, you can see that's kind of a stretch. But if you look over history, you find that people build paradigms of the world, and then you see enough cracks in it over time that the paradigm breaks and you build a new one. And the universe is infinitely large, so there are infinite theories you can use to explain the world, and we just pick a handful that work for our society. And so what I think happened was just no one knew what to do with this, where imagine in the 60s if the CIA had released all this astral projection stuff. And I don't want to go like this is stuff conspiracy theorists say, but our entire society is built off a right to rule of the material world being everything. That would challenge academia, it would challenge the military, it would challenge the government. And I mean, what happened when they finally did release it in 2016 is that the guy who ran the experiment, James Monroe, he had a page about how the teachings, the things he figured out were applicable to world religions. And then the CIA just removed that page because they didn't want people thinking of the applicability for religions and peace and stuff. And then Monroe released the version with the pages just to fuck with them. And so it's just, I think it was too much to bear, and they were scared of what the social implications would be. And the reason this stuff is coming out now and people like Joe Rogan like it so much is because our society's falling apart and people are desperate to find something else. but I don't like. I think even 10 years ago, I might have written this off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because like I know, when I was younger, I kind of went into the astral projection rabbit hole too, and I wasn't looking at it from the C. I didn't know anything about the CA studying it, but I just like reading a bunch of kind of mystical hippie books about it. And it's funny because some of the ones I read would say the same thing about how like, oh, you can project somewhere and you'll see things that are kind of real, but the closer you get to the spirit realm, everything becomes kind of like fucky, and you're not really seeing what is real anymore. So it's funny to see the CAA basically replicate that or say the same thing.
What I think is that in physics, everything has to have its counterpoint. You see this across the universe, where matter has antimatter. We have the night and the day on Earth. Humans replicate through man and woman. War and peace. Duality exists everywhere. And for something to exist, you have to have its opposite. Like life couldn't exist without death. And one of the things that I've gotten from ancient sources, but also the CIA stuff, is that the law of the spirit world is that anything you think is possible. It's limitless and it exists out of time. And the nature of our reality is that everything's incredibly finite, where every part of our lives is based off finiteness. We try to escape it. And so I think that kind of for our world to exist, you need its opposite. And that's kind of what the spirit world is, where it's real, but it's not real at the same time, where like you could see a horrible demon and that means nothing to you and the rest of your life is fine. Where it's balanced between where the realness of our world kind of needs its opposite. And I don't know if I'm making sense here.
Yeah, no, like I don't know if I'd use the word real. I'd say like, we have this world that we call real. It's physical.
Yeah.
And everything is very like static and solid. Things require a lot of force to change or manipulate because everything's like heavy. And if there's some opposite to that, like a spirit world, everything would be kind of etherical and fluid and, easy to move. And that's why you could, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So it's very fascinating.
What you want to go on to the to the tweet you got? I have a bunch. Look, we've kind
I was
of
going to
touched
ask
on
him about the free time question if you want.
Well, okay. Before we move on, I'm totally down with this whole, like, we need to try out ideas that are probably wrong. I'm constantly doing that. People are like, you got to have some willpower to do this because people will get really pissed off as soon as you start testing out new ideas. So props to you for doing it. I love doing it on the show. I'm constantly trying to find new ideas. One new idea that I encountered recently, it's funny because it's like Tim Pool's always talking about Civil War, and I always like kind of threw that away. I'm like, okay, he's just like insane. But then I read the Fourth Turning is Here and Peter Turchin book like back to back, and there's so much overlap. Cleodynamics is this science of history. I'm going,
Whoa! Look at all that. There's some good stuff in that heap of junk. I'm sure I can pawn it off for a hefty sum. And is that an ear I see squashed between those two sheets of metal? Ouch! Heh, I sure wouldn't want to be that pilot. Thanks, adventurer. Here's your pay. And here's some advice. Free of charge. If you look hard enough, you can always find profit in someone else's tragedy.
Great, I can get the crew working on this right away. Thanks, adventurer. Our racing team is the pride of goblins everywhere. You'd be surprised at some of the people who contribute in one way or another to our team. You know Gazlow? He tracks down parts from around the world for us. He even came down to work on one of our rigs once. A few weeks ago, he said he'd send us a new prototype fuel regulator, but it hasn't come yet. He's usually very prompt. Maybe you wouldn't mind going to Ratchet to ask him about it. I wouldn't be so pushy, but the gnomes are gaining on us.
never encountered any of this stuff before. So now all of a sudden I'm listening to Tim Pool and all the stuff he's saying. It seems kind of plausible here.
I mean, I don't know where else we can go, because in the modern America, we don't really think things can get as bad as they can. But if you read enough history, you realize
exactly
that all the time. and I look at our politics where we can't agree on anything, or we're so silly, and there's entrenched interests everywhere where, I mean, people talk about how you buy a house, you have to get your interior decoration improved by the local zoning board. You have to get your back fly screen approved by the local zoning board. And it feels like things are so tense. And I don't know if it'll be a civil war. Because the reason I say that, I bet good money that we'll have political violence in the next couple of years. I don't know if it'll be a civil war, because I think the right would just win. And because when it comes to military power, the right has the army, or most of the army, the police, young men as a general demographic, and aggressive young men especially. It has control of resources, a centralized location. And I could be wrong here. It could be because I always say on my show, I'm betting against God, and there's a billion ways infinity ways to be wrong, and only about a handful to be right.
True. Yeah.
And so I could be miscalculating where enough of the military tilts left that we would have a civil war. But my best guess is the right kills the left, and then we kind of fracture into warlords and conflict between the right, because the right doesn't have enough internal unity, and also due to the breakdown of law and authority, which is something I'm working on a video right now, where, for example, almost no cities in America have budgets. So something bad happens, every major city in America can't pay for police officers or social workers. And what happens once you've, like the Andrew Tates of the world, have congregated armies of young men to follow their orders?
Yeah.
Well, I think
kind of bleak.
In terms of like who would win this, like a quote civil war, I think it would depend highly on the context of why it's happening. Because like if, like for example, you know, if Trump got Pence to throw out the electoral votes from those swing states, and they just declared Trump, you know, president, and that kind of degraded into some kind of civil war situation. Like, I'm not sure the military, even if most people in it leaned right wing, I'm not sure that they would say, well, we're going to support this like very anti-demographic and anti-democratic, you know, thing that's just happened.
You're exactly right. The one condition where I see the left winning is where they basically bait the right into doing something retarded, and then the right gets fried. Where that's a really plausible scenario.
And I mean, we're seeing it. I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at the next like, I don't even know. I think we have about a year until stuff gets bad, because I don't think either side will trust the results for this next election, unless one side wins by a landslide. And then even if, like, the polls now say Trump is leading by 10 points, even if that happens, I'm not sure the Democrats would accept that. And so, but also, I mean, you guys saw how we passed a budget for 45 days, and it only barely passed.
Yeah.
And if the government shuts down, what happens next? And I mean, what happens if Trump goes to jail? There's all these. It's like World War I, where there were about 10 places where World War I could have happened because all of the historic forces built up to it, and it just happened to be in Serbia. And we're in the same place where we have all of these problems built up for a historic crisis. We just haven't seen where the match gets lit, where the entire floor is covered in gunpowder.
Yeah, it's hard because, like, and I remember watching this, and this kind of blackpilled me, watching kind of the build up to Russia invading Crimea. And I'd watch like a lot of the Ukrainians kind of interact with the Russians and all this stuff. And it seemed like everyone was kind of LARPing until they weren't. And I've kind of come to this like bad idea that people basically LARP themselves into war, because it's hard to like right now I look around, I'm like, yeah, I see a lot of people are very divided, I see a lot of people very angry, but it's still hard for me to conceptualize how that turns into some kind of like factions fighting each other in the streets, you know, over politics or something.
One of the points Turchin makes is that we don't have like revolution organizations. But what I'd say is that the internet allows that very easily, where I don't think people have really realized the potential that the internet has for group organization or for strategy, where you could launch a revolution out of a subreddit if you wanted. I mean, that might be a bit far because you get banned, but and also you only need a single match to go off, and then people start organizing. And Yeah, I agree. It's LARPing until it isn't. And think of COVID, where people in that field were saying that we were due for a pandemic for decades, and then COVID hit. And I remember I was in I was in Peru when COVID hit, and I had a friend from China who called me up and he said, "This stuff's really bad. You need to get back to America now." And then I got out of Peru on the last flight that they had to America.
Wow.
No, it was the last flight, and I got there on the last call. But things like this shit can go down really fast if all the variables are lined up. And I mean, January of 2020, we had no idea what was going on, and in March, our entire lives had changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's still just hard for me to think about, like, I mean, I can see a world where, Antifa or leftist groups and Proud Boy like groups are like basically fighting each other, but it's still it's too difficult for me. My imagination is too limited to kind of conceptualize, like, the Congress is like doesn't exist, or like the Republicans and the Democrats are in the streets like shooting at each other. Like, even if Trump gets arrested, I can't really see that unless something really insane happens regarding the election.
I agree with that.
They have firsthand accounts of like the Civil War and stuff, and people during the Civil War didn't see it coming.
Yeah.
So I mean,
like, but there's a big difference. Like, so in the Civil War, it's like there's literally just this fear of your entire life in the South is going to be changed by getting rid of slavery. Like this entire, like there's a very specific, very physical, very tangible thing that's happening. Where with this, it's kind of etherical, like what exactly, it's people like debating over politics. Like, obviously material conditions are making everyone crazy, but there's not like a specific material condition everyone's like really focused on as the central point here.
They incarcerate Trump.
Yeah, but I don't think that's enough.
You don't think that's enough to really
incarcerate Trump? Election doesn't work out. I mean, for all of the secular crises, or most of them, the thing that spurs it is a budget problem. And that's how the French Revolution started, where ironically, the French government doing the American Revolution was one of the biggest things that caused the French Revolution, because they couldn't afford to support the American colonies, where the French government just couldn't pay its bills, and they convened the Congress together. And then the Congress said, unless you don't turn France into a democracy, we're not going to let you raise taxes. And then that's what caused the French Revolution. And that's pretty common. And so if I had to bet on anything, it would be that the next time we try to pass a budget, it just doesn't work. And that sounds kind of nerdy, but like, I mean, it's like, imagine you're married and you hate your partner and you get into an argument over money. The number one cause for divorces is money problems. And that's my best bet. And I mean, we've barely passed it the last couple of times where, and each time it's passed with the Republicans making concessions, but past a certain point, you end up in a situation where the leaders are incentivized to launch a civil war, because by launching a civil war, they get to stay in power. And if they make concessions, they won't get reelected.
I mean, I can always think of a dozen things. Like, what if the election is contested and Putin invades a NATO country during the contested election? What if Putin invades a NATO country during another January 6th? Like, there's a million things that I can think of that could happen to really take the wheels off of this thing.
It's like it's interesting, where a couple years ago I would have unanimously supported, if China invaded Taiwan, I would have supported America going to war with China. And I don't support that anymore, because I think if we had a war with China now, it would break the US.
Do you think Putin and China are talking to one another? What if China takes Taiwan at the same exact time Putin invades Poland?
One of my friends, Philippe Fabry, he kind of does the same stuff I do, where he uses the cycles of history to predict the future, and he's based out of France. And that's what he predicts, that Putin will go after the Baltics afterwards. I personally think Putin would be insane to do that, because the Russian military's performance in Ukraine, like, they wouldn't survive an invasion of a NATO.
Look, he doesn't have to be insane. He just has to have nothing to lose, which I think you can make an argument that he has nothing to lose.
He has to have something to gain.
Peter Zeihan says is, and I just finished. I have a video in the works for why I think Russia will have a revolution in the next couple of years. And I mean, past a certain point, I don't know. Chaos. I'm betting against God. It could happen. I can't say. But
Putin right now is praying for a contested election. You know he is, because he's hanging on by the skin of his teeth in Ukraine, and he knows if America and Europe stop sending them weapons, it's over.
I also think that as a young man in Russia, I don't know why I'd be fighting, because I'd imagine they have the same economic and dating and whatever problems we have in America, and if you're just going to be cannon fodder in a useless war, why don't you mutiny? And yeah, I think the Chinese and the Russians could go for that. And if we had to wage a war, it's like extra couple problem, where you have a couple that's already worried about money and they fight over how they spend it. And then their mother has an enormous medical bill, and the husband hates his wife's mother anyway, and so he's not going to give away his money for that, and then they divorce. It's kind of a similar situation.
Yeah.
Do you think, though, is it the budget that's the problem, or is it people in terms of how the economy is doing? Like, if we had if we had like a 2008 housing crash now, like, again, you know, they're all worried about the commercial housing market and stuff like that. Like, maybe that would cause a problem, because with the budget stuff, I mean, I'm assuming with France at the time, they were not on fiat currency. So I feel like now the government can just basically print itself out of any problem.
A stock market crash, though, you can't really print yourself.
That's why I'm saying, I
mean, I think all of the above is going to happen, because we're at a place where I think we have to have a stock market crash or some kind of equalization of the stock market. I actually think it's a decently likely scenario that, like, rightist rebels just wipe out the major coastal corporations. I think if you have a rightist revolution, there's a solid chance they just wipe out Hollywood and Silicon Valley, and they might leave Wall Street.
When you say wipe out, are you talking about economically or like with force? Like,
yeah, let's hope it's economically. I live here.
With force.
You think like people are gonna like march into Apple and stuff? Like, what do you mean?
Why not? I mean, they don't those companies anyway.
Right.
And I mean, with these historical cycles, you have to see inequality decline, and that can either be violent or peaceful. I'm sorry if that's a black pill, but
that's Turchin's thesis, the overproduction of the elites. The only way that you can deal with it is you make the elites not so elite anymore. And there's two ways historically that we usually do that. It's with guillotines or financial crashes, right?
Yeah. And I mean, what we've seen recently is the labor shortage. And I do wonder how much of our stuff with immigration, complete open borders, is due to the labor shortage, where upper class left-leaning Americans want there to be an infinite sponge of immigrants because of the labor shortage. And the thing is, once you have a labor shortage, you can't have a giant stock market, because the stock market is driven by the upper class, and you would need to see an equalization. And I've been really shocked that we haven't had a stock market crash so far. And what we've basically just seen is poverty among everyone else. But because the upper classes are largely doing fine, the stock market continues to function. But I mean, it's what we would see with inflation to prop up the rest of the economy is basically the attacks of the lower classes, because the lower classes are the ones that get hit the hardest by inflation, because they're the ones where if the price of pork goes up 20%, it really hurts them, or if the price of housing. And the reason the price of housing has gone up so fast is because of inflation, because if you have an inflating currency, the housing market is a stable, real asset. And the government can't push that button for much longer until everything falls apart.
Yeah. So where do you want to go?
So I don't know if you saw, do you know the YouTube channel History Civilis?
I've watched like one or two of his videos.
Yeah, he does like a lot of Roman. He used to, or he does primarily like a lot of videos about Roman history and stuff. And then recently he had a video that I didn't really like, that I've seen kind of echo this idea that, you know, we've basically are like that humans today under capitalism are working longer hours and harder and for less, you know, material benefit than both a hunter-gatherer cave people and also like feudal serfs. How do you feel about these ideas?
Yeah, this is one of those things where it's a sampling bias, where the hardness of people's lives is dependent upon very specific conditions to that era of history. And so people ask me, what was life like in the Middle Ages? And I say it's 1,000 years. You got to get more specific. But when people talk about serfs working less than today, they're talking around 1200, which was the equivalent of the 1950s, where quality of life goes through these cycles that are around like 200 years long. And so there were parts of the Middle Ages where people worked not a lot of hours and they were pretty well off. And there were parts of the Roman Empire, but also right before the Black Death, when Europe was really overpopulated and when inequality was super high, people were working multiple jobs and they still couldn't feed themselves. Or there were points in the 1600s where people literally were working themselves to death because the calories they got from working didn't match out to the calories that they could get from, they expended more calories than they could buy. And so that's not really a fair comparison because these things fluctuate really quickly. And I think your average American works like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week now, or maybe that's too high for average, but that's what I've seen from a lot of people. And that's a really hard work schedule. But even back in the 1950s, people would work 8 hours a day, but also you'd have really long lunches and people would grab drinks like back in the day, people would drink in the afternoons during work. And that's just unimaginable now.
Right.
I read a book on prohibition and I was amazed at how much people used to drink. I mean, they drink all day long at work. It was like kind of crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder how much of that was women entering the workforce because like my entire staff is male and we drink during meetings and it's not a problem.
Nice.
That's hilarious.
Well, I mean, there's a whole idea that like switching from alcohol to coffee and tea like made the Enlightenment happen and all that stuff. But okay, so this kind of idea that people are better off under serfdom, it sounds like you're saying like, well, yeah, there were specific time periods that it was maybe better, but overall, no.
One of my pet peeves is people kind of use capitalism as a proxy for the human condition.
Right.
Well, because the irony is that your economic system doesn't matter that much compared to the supply of labor and productivity. And so even in like incredibly economically repressive systems, if there's not, under Russian serfdom in the 1600s, when it was a really underpopulated country, it wasn't that bad to be a serf. But under modern capitalism, which is the most advanced economic condition, if you have bad labor and productivity, you'll live a pretty shitty life. And so, and so
what do you mean by it wasn't like? What is the comparison that you're making? I guess.
The biggest thing that matters for quality of life is how many people are competing for your job and what your productivity as a person is. So we've increased productivity by 70% since the 1970s, but we've also increased the labor pool 40% more than our productivity would allow. And we've done that through a combination of women entering the workforce, immigration, globalization, automation, and a bunch of other things, and population growth too. And so this is one of my pet peeves that I don't realize when no one else puts together. People complain that people are struggling economically and working longer hours, and then they don't fit. And then they'll also say in the next breath, we need to take more immigration. We need to globalize our economy. And I'm thinking, you don't realize that these are two sides of the same coin. And so there were points where serfdom, you had an easier chance to live a better life. But every economic system goes through a phase where life is really shitty for the average person.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good point. That, well, it's weird because I mean, I don't know enough about it because I've always heard from various economic people that essentially the economic policies put forward by the government from like the 40s through the late 70s were very heavily focused on pro-labor.
Yeah.
And then after that, Reagan comes in and basically demolishes that and brings in kind of like neoliberal economic policies. So is it like the policies that were really changing it, or is it just that the labor pool opened up so much because of globalization?
It's hard to say. It's a chicken and egg thing where and what you're saying is true, where post-war period, people were very pro-labor because everyone in the back of their head knew that they had to fight at D-Day or Iwo Jima. And one of the biggest things that Walter Scheidel wrote a book about this, one of the biggest things that collapses inequality is war, because we taxed the rich a tremendous amount during the world wars because there was this shared national mission. And what happened with Reagan was that we had kind of pushed that logic and the economy was in decline. And so we pushed towards less pro-labor positions, but that also coincided with we took an ideology that benefited globalization and the lowering of labor at the same time as we did it. And it's kind of a chicken egg where I don't know which really came first.
Right. Well, it seems like a lot of these it's annoying because it seems like the way these big changes occur in history and in countries is that there's all these forces that are continually trying to pull a country or an ideology or philosophy in a direction always. And that's just the right circumstances kind of happen at one time that allows it to go down that trackway.
I mean, one of my pet peeves is people think countries are designed by their greatest geniuses. Well, the reality is they kind of just happen. And you look over your life, and one of my friends likes to say, predict what you'll do in the next week and then see how much you actually follow that. And people almost never do what they plan over the next week because we're not controlled by the forces that we think. We're not rational beings. We're just controlled by a bunch of different irrational desires inside of us that take turns doing different stuff. And you look back over history and it's those irrational desires are the ones that are calling the shots, and the policymakers
here on Thunderbluff. But I cannot forgive those who drove us from our ancestral lands as easily as some. My people inhabited the southern barrens for decades. The land was holy to us, but we were driven off by numerous foes. A vengeful fate awaits the crone Charga Razorflank, who musters a foul army from within Razorfen Crowl. Bring me Razorflank's heart and I can die in peace, adventurer.
As you can see, adventurer, we're up to some very interesting experiments at the Royal Apothecary Society. As the master here, it is my job to oversee the most ambitious of our alchemical attempts. So much work and so little time. You look well traveled for an adventurer. Perhaps you can aid me. I'm in need of a rare substance. It's foul material. It comes from a rare species of bats only found in the muck hole known as Razorfen Crowl. Bring to me the guano from the Crowl bats so we can begin our work.
Still recharging.
We pick just reflect whatever the public's will is.
How do you feel about FDR? He's a very contentious president, depending on who you ask. He's either loved or hated.
I like him a lot.
Oh wow.
I think what he did was, I think the economics of the New Deal were wrong. I don't think he understood economics. I liked that he brought us through a really hard period of our existence, the Great Depression and World War II. And then that's not something I'd want to take for granted. And I don't throw away good leaders when I see them, because history is mostly bad leaders. And I think a lot of what he did was basically just psychological reassurance for the country. And that was what we needed. But I think we could have had a lot worse than FDR.
Mm-hmm.
If you buy into generational theory, well, let's say if generational theory is correct, because obviously we're going to see how it plays out here over the next 10 years or so. But if those guys are right, the next president of the United States will be a Lincoln or a FDR,
yeah,
or George Washington. Well, it's maybe a Hitler. I mean, I guess it could be because Hitler was on the German side of the FDR equation. So, I mean, if it's
Stalin was too.
Yeah. So I guess since you said that, like I don't look. I can't imagine Biden being the next FDR.
No, I'm from the same town as Biden. We both lived in the town of Centerville, Delaware, which is right in the Pennsylvania border. And the town of Centerville has a diner and a thrift shop, and that's it. It's out in rural Delaware. And Biden lived in a state a mile outside town.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, it makes me think this election, like this, if generational theory guys are correct, this election is a lot higher stakes than most people are even aware of.
I don't see any of the candidates being that. I try to never stalk candidates on my show.
You don't think Kamala Harris is going to be the next FDR?
I think she is. I mean, her just raw charisma and ability to understand the struggles of modern Americans.
Look, Trump has already said that he's the next best president to Lincoln. I mean, he's already out there staking his flag, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things with Trump is just, I'm 22. I'm tired of silent generation people running the country.
Yeah.
Because if we're going to have another Biden versus Trump, that's two people who were basically born during World War II. And I mean, you must have seen the clips with Mitch McConnell or...
oh, yes. Yeah. I'm worried we're going to see that with Biden.
Nancy Pelosi as well. And the great... So we've had two Pennsylvanian presidents in our history, Buchanan and Biden. And the reason for that as a Pennsylvanian is we are the state that has the most cultural similarity with other parts of the country. That if your society is falling apart and you want a candidate to appease as many groups as possible, you pick a Pennsylvanian. Because we're close to the South, we're kind of the Midwest, we're kind of the Northeast. And that's why Biden's in power, because Biden can appease different groups inside the Democratic Party. And I can't believe he'd run again, because I don't think he could play a game of Guess Who. I don't think he could play a game of chess and not pass out, let alone a game of international politics as his society is falling apart. But also, you look at the Democrats, and I don't see them putting up any leaders that could replace him. And another Trump versus Biden, it's like you read other periods of history where a 9-year-old child is on the throne and a bunch of corrupt eunuchs and like mistresses manage the government. That's what it feels like now.
It's exactly what it feels like.
Yeah, I was very shocked for a long time. I didn't think Biden was going to run again. I was like, no. Maybe I'm curious if he's only running because Trump is running, which is possible. You know, people are making noise now that they think Gavin Newsom is going to be the secret replacement, and that's why he wants to debate DeSantis. Which, I mean, that could happen, but I just feel like that's also kind of stupid from the Democrats' perspective because of like crime. Like right now, I think
what's his target demographic?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, you know, I think the Republicans kind of screwed themselves with the abortion stuff in terms of electability. But now the Democrats have basically taken an advantage of throwing the trash can with crime and immigration. And Gavin Newsom is going to be like the easy focal point to point to and be like, look how bad crime and immigration is. You know, Gavin Newsom is, especially in California, like Gavin Newsom is like the head of that. So I don't see how he's going to defeat Trump or whomever.
This is kind of a strange point, but I think Gavin Newsom, as an attractive white male, would hurt his position in the Democratic Party today, because he is the epitome. He also, I think he's from an upper class background, because the Democrats at this point are so woke that they would really struggle to have an attractive upper class white male as their candidate. And Biden is so old that you kind of like can't look up to him. And so, because remember where the reason they put Kamala in power was because she was a black woman. Right. And that was 4 years ago when our society was still more sane. And it's like, I mean, hot take, and this isn't my speciality, it wouldn't surprise me if Michelle Obama takes the lead. But also she's polling really low right now.
You think she's actually gonna run?
Didn't she say she wanted to run?
Did she? I know people were making much of noise
I
about
see
it.
her in polls, and I'm like, what is this? Why is Michelle Obama in this poll?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's a year is a long time.
It is. Okay? Yeah.
And I mean, hell, like we could have a famine in the third world. We could have a war with China. Like a lot of things can happen in a year.
Mm-hmm. It is kind of baffling, and I guess that does speak a lot to wokeness. That people are like urging Michelle Obama to run when it's like, well, what are her qualifications? I mean, she's
very likable.
She's likable. She seems like a nice person. She's a lawyer, right?
What qualifications do we even pick for president anymore?
Charisma.
I guess. I mean, you could say the same thing of Trump, I guess, or Biden's
He's
dying.
Funny.
So
Michelle's not funny.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think do you think wokeness is getting worse or better? Because I feel like people are starting to get fed up with wokeness.
Well, and how do you define wokeness first?
That's a good
for the class.
I define wokeness as an ideology based upon a worldview stemming from oppression, with a focus on sex and race, where it's philosophically structured the exact same as communism, and it also comes from a postmodernist background. And to shorten that, it's basically communism without a concept of truth, which shifted out the working classes for the sexual identities and race.
I agree. I concur.
Yeah, someone in our audience, they titled it "Intersectional Marxism," which I think is a good.
Yeah, I mean, it's philosophically the exact same structure as Marxism. And what I'd say with wokeness is that it's reached its peak audience, where things often go on curves, where empires normally reach their largest geographic extent after they've already started to go into decline. Companies normally reach their largest market share when the factors that already caused their decline have started to appear. And so for wokeness, I think we've started to see the factors that are going to kill wokeness already going on. And I don't think wokeness is converting anyone new.
What are those factors?
That wokeness just is retarded. It doesn't make it is one of I say this as a person who studied every major philosophy and religion. Wokeness is one of the worst designed of all time. I cannot believe that it's real. It's just like and also we built this worst ideology when we had the most information ever. Just wokeness is horribly designed because it actively.
So it's designed badly to produce truth or to produce political power? Because I feel like it's designed well to produce political power. I don't think it's designed well to produce truth, and that's kind of the problem.
It's designed to shame a successful, wealthy society with Christian values. I can only exist in a wealthy society from Christian origin because it's built upon a bunch of. If we were in the Middle East or China, the societies that don't care about love, that don't have like love and accepting the meek as their dominant virtues, they just laugh at woke people.
Sure.
And
if they don't have the prohibition on racism that we have, obviously, because that's a giant component. Most people.
If the Nazis won World War II and like race study was still like an academic discipline, we would never have had wokeness. But wokeness is horribly designed. Because it shits on its own followers as terrible people, It shits on the majority population as terrible people. It has no mechanization for organization. Standards are bad, and so you can't, if you don't have standards, you can't organize people. It thinks reproduction is terrible. It thinks using force is terrible. It doesn't have a concept of it's just wokeness is incapable of doing anything as an ideology. And whenever you look at woke organizations, they immediately fail. And so it kind of weirds me out because I look at Disney or other woke organizations and I think, how do these people survive another 2 years? Because Disney blew itself up in like 2 or 3 years from wokeness. And that's true of most woke organizations. How do the universities survive another couple of years? And it trips me up that I think about 8 to 10% of the population are actually woke, where it's 50-50 right-left. And then most people on the left are kind of normies who don't accept, who just want to help people and who are sympathetic people, or they're sympathetic towards others. And then woke people are like 8 to 10% of the population, and they basically lead the leftist normies behind them.
Aren't all the woke people, like if you look at Turchin's Elite Aspirant musical chairs game, it seems like the wokeness is a excellent weapon to use in that Elite Aspirant game. So it seems like the 8% are these elite aspirants that are just using wokeness to eviscerate one another.
Yeah, I have a lot of relatives that are like super hard left, and they're all people who got good college degrees, and then that didn't lead them anywhere.
Right.
And you're seeing with the organizations where they're seizing control and then controlling hiring, so their people get elected. In a lot of cases, because that's people who don't have. What we did is we over-indexed on credentialism, or getting degrees as a way to signify high social, like competency. But the degrees don't actually do that. Where one of the things I found is for hiring people, I've interviewed a couple people from Harvard. They're not good employees because they're too stressed, anxious. They can't adapt to the real world. They're not good team players. And in almost all cases, they're from upper class families that built their entire lives about that. And so we over-indexed on credentialism, and then that wasn't actually useful. And so wokeness is a way of, it's a way of bringing credentialism to override merit, because wokeness doesn't have and this is something I get from communism, the left doesn't have a philosophic concept of competency or merit built into any part of their worldview.
Right.
True. Well, and also, I mean, because I agree with you that I think wokeness is not able to replicate power in the long term, because as you kind of what you were saying is, if you're going to try to use guilt as your primary weapon to attack the majority of people in the country, who are white and also that are male, it's like you're basically very few people can use wokeness at the end of the day to keep gaining more and more power. Because if you're white and male, you're kind of setting up the seeds of your own destruction.
Exactly.
So, I don't think that's going to propagate long term.
There's no way to win as well. And this is like, what's his name again? The Scottish guy, the critical drinker. I was listening to one of his podcasts, and he said, it's this strange worldview that tells you that you're a horrible person no matter what you do, and then you're expected to accept it. And it shocked me no one realized this cognitive bug until pretty late, because it was obvious to me ever since I started seeing wokeness. And it's, one of my friends likes to say that the left is incapable of thinking over time. And that's really true, where the left predicts emotional reactions, but not real world reactions, where like the left's lack of strategy shocks me, because I grew up playing strategy games. I was addicted to StarCraft, Company of Heroes, Civilization when I was in middle school. And so my brain works that way. And so I'm automatically thinking, what is the next move the other side plays?
Right.
And the left doesn't do that at all. They're not thinking the incentives they set up with their coalitions, and their worldview is entirely based off logic. Emotion. And so the left is good at predicting the emotional states they will entice among their coalition. They're basically just trying to piss off the right as much as possible. But there's no thought about what happens. How do they keep power? How do they keep their people inside their coalition from working with them? How do they keep the other side from killing them? And I just find it astounding, if I'm honest.
Mm-hmm.
They do have the one strategy that I find interesting where they latched on to like George Lakoff and framing for a while, and they were like, look, we can win Republicans over if we just use the right magical words and talk to them in words that they accept as valuable, which
that's
I
not
thought
really woke,
I mean
though. That's like the left, like
the left is the best,
but it is like a strategy that you can see in there, even though it's like, I don't think it's a good strategy. I think it's completely like misplaced, but yeah, exactly. But I do see a kind, like a butt of a strategy there. So
yeah, the left is incredibly good at language. One of my friends, this is his area of study, and he's done a lot of incredible work here, and he calls it GSR, or gossiping, shaming, and rallying. It's basically the feminine form of aggression, where if girls, it's something women largely use as a way to gain social authority, and it's the political version of Mean Girls, and the left is able to do it because our society lacks a shared moral compass to basically denounce things that we believe are bad. And so the left has made a game of saying that everything is bad and they have a better alternative, but society never asks them what their better alternative is. And that's like, I remember when I was in high school, we had people running for class president, and people were promising all this stuff, like, I'm going to make an ice cream machine, we'll get more vacation days. And all of that was impossible, but the promise was still nice. And so the left's use of language is something that's unparalleled anywhere else in the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because, like, so in a video you made, I think it's like your previous couple of videos, you had like the chart where you're like the left, and you had the 10 things that make up the left and 10 things that make up the right. And I broadly agree with everything that you said. And the number one thing at the top was the left believes all humans are perfectible, and the right believes that humans are inherently flawed. And I've always also kind of conceptualized it that way. And that's kind of why, the right tends to look at society and culture as a civilizing factor on humans that are born, sinful or evil, and the left kind of looks at society and culture as a corrupting influence that kind of destroys some perfect human nature. And yet, it's weird because, like, with wokeness, and I guess for socialism overall, like, the left has kind of replicated the right, everyone is sinful. They're just putting like what creates the sin in a different area, but it's still this like no-win situation.
Yeah, they have no concept of truth. So this is something I run into with people who aren't on the left, is they expect it to make sense, and I just thrown that out the window. I expect anything the left makes sense too. I don't expect anything the left says to make sense. And
yeah, no, like I know it doesn't make sense, but it's interesting to see it replicated again. Like, it's kind of like with CRT. They very clearly say, like, oh, we're not biological essentialists, but then they just become cultural essentialists.
I mean, it's also that they also are biological essentialists. Like, if you're the whole thing of, if you're white, you can't transfer to being black. Like, your race and your caste determines your position in the left. And I also think that because the left is incapable of acknowledging the left today doesn't believe in reality, and it sounds like I'm making that up, but I took a course in gender studies. I've read a lot of critical theory texts. They don't think they think you can make reality whatever you want.
Yeah.
And once you do that, you start to have all these very negative things seep in because you don't have boundaries. And so, in your attempt to build a perfect world, you end up with a really bad one because you're not dealing with the world as it exists. And like, I like to say that communists promise a utopia, and then the actual reality is that they enslave the working classes. Because if you look at Stalinist Russia, it's just mass slavery, where they feed you enough to survive, and that's it. And the state takes the rest. And for feminism, the end result is that we have the worst female mental health in history, and people don't have kids. And women have lost relationships that were important to them. And what was your question again? I'm sorry.
Well, no, it was interesting to see this original sin basically replicated by the left. It's almost, it's funny the way you're describing it. It's almost like the left is treating the physical world like the spirit world, and that's what's leading them down this path.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, another interesting point about this is the difference between why wokeness is such a horrible ideology and why Christianity is a better ideology. Because look, I'm an atheist, so I don't necessarily buy into the Christian philosophy, but I can see that the narrative motivates a lot of people, and it seems like it gets the human psychology right, that humans are flawed and that we need examples in our life to strive to be better. And the left is more like, whatever inner feeling that you have is perfect just exactly the way it is, and you just need to change society to accept that. And I just one philosophy seems to work at a practical level in the real world, and one I don't think works over time at all.
I just made a 50-minute video that I'll hopefully release tomorrow about Christianity's impact on history. And what I'd say is that religions that are successful long-term acknowledge that the world is hard, and then from that, they offer an optimistic vision.
Yes.
Religions that fail offer panaceas that with no effort. And so with Hinduism, Judaism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Christianity, every religion ever that's successful, they acknowledge that life is hard, that we make mistakes, that we're not fully in control of ourselves. And then from that, they offer, if you take, basically explaining it to an atheist, if you take these standards inside of yourself, you will gradually become more like the standards. And the thing with the left, and this is also true of Nazism and Gnosticism and other flash in the pan ideologies that don't last more than a century, is that they offer, if you just agree with us, we will give you heaven on earth. And then what ends up happening is that doesn't occur. And because there is no feedback loop for self-reflection, people externalize that to the rest of the world. And I actually feel sorry for young women today because they have the worst mental health in history. And among Gen Z girls, they're really fried by the mental health and social problems we have today. And the thing is that the cruel thing is that feminism doesn't offer them any real solutions. It tells them that they're perfect and to blame everything on men, or it tells them that they're perfect, but because they're perfect, they psychologically have to blame things on men because that's the only mechanism that exists if you're perfect. But that's in reality a really cruel thing to do because you're not actually offering someone any advice or acknowledging what their lives are really like.
It's kind of the psychological equivalent of domesticating wild animals when they're not able to exist anyway in the world. They're just functionally inept.
I mean, if we're being real, the left exists to benefit the managerial class, and because people with college degrees end up being managers. And if you're part of the managerial class, you want people to be as
docile,
as
domesticated,
domesticated, as hedonistic as possible, because that way they're not going to ask too many questions. And the thing that I would lead back to is, why are the biggest corporations in the world supporting hedonism and also a group that tells them that capitalism and their society is terrible?
Well, those things seem contradictory to me. I understand why they would support hedonism, because there is kind of a hedonistic element to capitalism that makes it work. I mean, capitalism runs on sales. With the suicidal elements of the left of saying our societies and capitalism is terrible, the reason the big corporations have teamed up with them, in my opinion, is because both the left and these large corporations, their end goal is to give the authorities more power. And this is something that people on the left they never think about. But I remember I was debating Vaush, and I asked him, what are your first policies? And he said, raise taxes. And I said, I thought, you're an anarchist. How is raising taxes your first policy? If you ask people on the left, they want to have the stateless utopia. But the biggest thing before that is we need to give the authorities more power. And so
by the time you get to be a mega corporation, I mean, a joke I've heard is that when you start out with your company, you're libertarian. By the time you're a billionaire, you're a communist because you are the government. And so, by pushing the left, they end up giving the authorities more power, and the biggest companies are the authorities.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think, because like, when you were talking about earlier about how, most people on the left, they just kind of want to help people, and then there's this 8% of, people that are woke that are kind of taking advantage of that.
They also want to help people, but they've pushed it so far that it's morphed into something evil.
Right. And I listen to a lot of boomers who talk about this stuff, who, they're not very involved in internet politics.
Yeah.
And they kind of just perceive wokeness and a lot of this stuff as like the continuation of the civil rights movement. They don't really understand that it's not that it's like the far leftist movement of civil rights. It's not like the MLK liberal movement. And I don't know if the corporations that are kind of replicating wokeness, I'm assuming that they don't realize like the Marxist undertones to what they're doing.
They're in the boomer camp, is what you're saying.
I think it's a combination. And like, I can't stand boomers with this stuff. And because I was watching Fast Times at Ridgemont High last night, and those that don't know, it's a high school movie set in the 80s. And the thing is, Joe Biden was 40 years old when that came out. And for me, as a 22-year-old, the society of the 1980s was unrecognizable. One of the things that shocks me is no one in Gen Z has social skills. It's funny where I always thought I was a nerd. I'm a nerd, but I'll run into people that are like chads or attractive girls or anything, and they'll have worse social skills than a lot of nerds I know, because just there is no shared culture. And so like Gen Z has no social skills. No one would be talking to each other at the mall. It's like taboo to pick up girls. Like if a girl's your waitress, it's taboo to like try to hit on her. None of these people in high school, like when I went to high school, no one was messing around or like goofing off or.
Really?
Yeah, like if you go to Gen Z in high school, it's mostly you do get some crazy parties, and like binge drinking is a big part of Gen Z culture, but it's not like. The thing with Gen Z partying is it exists almost as an opiate to cover up how depressing the rest of your life is. So people get completely wasted because they have poor social skills and they're just looking to cut loose. But also, comparing the infrastructure 40 years ago, it's the same. Like the house I live in was built in the 70s. It's the same infrastructure. It's just it looks really crappy now. And it was crazy because I lived in LA for a few months to see the stuff that looked filthy when I lived there was the exact same stuff at Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but it looked clean. And I couldn't believe the city looked clean back then. But the thing with the boomers is, like, if you watch even older stuff, like The Twilight Zone, which came out in the 50s, the buildings that look disgusting now they looked absolutely beautiful. And I can't imagine growing up in the 50s and understanding modern America and the country I live in. And because if you grew up in the 50s, Jim Crow was the law of the land in a third of the country. And so for the boomers, I think it's just incredibly difficult for them to understand what life is like. And I'm not going to cut them slack because their lack of empathy is really just not good. It's not okay. And I also think like George Soros has got to know what he's doing. And the world, Klaus Schwab got to know what he's doing. And so I think it's a combination of that. And I think a lot of these elites realize that they're on very precarious ground. They just don't understand through what method. And so I think a lot of people on the left pick up that our society is not in a good place. And then they externalize that worry to climate change. And so all their worries of their life have been externalized to climate change. And I think the elite has been scrambling, and they're trying to appease the left, partially because there's a lot of left-wing sympathies, but also they see the left as the real dissidents that could wipe them out.
Yeah. I don't know, like when I look at Schwab and Soros, I mean, Soros is so old now, I don't know what's going on with him. But with Schwab, I mean, I just get the sense when I listen to them talking that a lot of these people think they want to build Star Trek. They think that's the future they want
That's
to build
such a good
towards.
way of putting it.
And they just don't understand. Like that's where their intuitions are kind of guiding them, but they have no clue how to get there. Because I mean,
Yeah.
I think I think you get the Star Trek through basically capitalism creating the material
Yeah.
conditions that allows it to occur, and they're kind of like, no, let's try to get the philosophy first, and then we'll figure out the material conditions. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's how that works.
I also think that there's no comprehension among these like boomer elite types about how easily society can fall apart and also
Yeah.
how far we are.
Yes.
Because you're part of Gen Z, you already kind of live in, I don't want to sound dramatic, you already kind of live in a failed society where Gen Z doesn't, it's so politically split, where one of my friends said, the only thing Gen Z shares is digital induced psychosis. And I mean, I'm from Philadelphia. It was crazy to look at the clips because the areas in Philadelphia that were looted and there's shootings, I would jog there at midnight. I lived in downtown Philadelphia for 5 years and I never had crime problems. And I don't think these people are aware. And also for like, my best friend's from a working class background. In the neighborhood he grew up in, it's plurality white, and almost everyone they do weed to just get through their jobs. The social community is completely broken down. Almost no people's parents are together or do not have some kind of drug problem. And I think just among like working class normal people, normal society has broken down, and the chances that you get married and have family and that doesn't fall apart, or we have a normal social community, is just completely dead. I don't think there's any comprehension of that among the people running our society.
Yeah, no, I mean I agree completely, and it's hard for me to conceptualize because I'm older than you. I'm in my 30s, and I was kind of like I went to school in the 90s and in the 2000s, and we were kind of at like that cutoff range, kind of between the 80s, Fast Times at Richmond High, and like kind of what you're describing now.
Fast Times at Ridgemont High. What are you talking?
Excuse me. Yes. Okay. Xer. But yeah, it's kind of in that like cusp, like between like turning away from that into I guess what we're now. And when I went to school, it was like I remember cell phones. I think I was like in like middle school when like cell phones first started to become like a thing that like people could have.
Oh,
and
man.
they're these little crappy. We had those like really terrible Motorola flip phones for a while, and then finally they kind of transformed into those little Nokia like bricks. And I remember, it's so funny. I remember being in 7th grade, and we had a substitute teacher, and she was talking about how cool it is she could play Snake on her phone, and that was like the height of technological achievement. And I'm sitting here as like someone who played Game Boy. I'm like, this is the lamest crap ever, and everyone was so enamored with playing Snake, and it's like I can't even imagine now with kids with the smartphones and social media just being on that constantly 24/7, how that just completely changes their reality and how they interact with each other and how they don't have social skills now.
What was a real black pill for me is when I dropped out of school. This is part of the reason I dropped out of school. I apologize for the flex. I was invited to a social club for talented young people. So they basically selected some of the most successful young people across different fields, whether startups or entertainment or influencers. And I met a lot of these people. And so I'm meeting the most successful. And the sad thing is a lot of them didn't like lead good lives. They were like almost all of them had real mental health problems. The most successful guys, very few of them were in relationships. They didn't like trust the people around them. A lot more had money problems than you'd expect. And so it was this real black pill. And also like a lot of my friends back in the day were players and people this is going to sound cringe, you'd call players and chads. And it was depressing for me to watch because even these guys who were very good with women, they weren't satisfied at all because they weren't able to get into relationships that they found fulfilling. And you can only live the fuckboy lifestyle for a few years at most before you want to shoot yourself. And it was a real black pill to look at the most successful Gen Z people and realize that they had all the same problems that I saw from my hometown or like working class friends I had. And I knew that I think a lot of people hold out this kind of myth that if they try really hard, they can live the perfect life. And I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that you see all these celebrities crash and burn in really horrific ways, like Justin Bieber or Kanye or the various Disney stars or like Demi Lovato. And I just think our society is sick at its core. And I don't think anyone is really winning if you're under the age of 30 or something.
Well, I mean, I think that the maladies that afflict the youth, the average youth person, I would categorize as very different than what hits like very successful and famous people. Because I tend to look at it like people's strengths are generally also their greatest weaknesses. So the people that are going to be, you know, the most motivated to get to these like top echelons are also going to have, you know, no life, or they're going to be, you know, driven to the point of basically killing themselves.
What I found for both Gen Z across all social classes, from the highest to the lowest, was loneliness. I think loneliness and lack of any sense of purpose were the things that affected people of every social class.
Is it just because of all the internet stuff that everyone doesn't interact in person anymore?
I don't think it's just the internet. Do you know the Mouse Utopia experiments?
Yeah.
I think it's that too, where I think just our society is in social free fall and people are losing the ability to have interpersonal relationships. And I think that it's also everyone feels economic instability where even if you're like a very wealthy CEO who made a successful company, you have to do another successful company after that. And that's a kamikaze strike. And the payout will be less than you expected. And the thing is, if you're in a city like Los Angeles, even if you're making 100K, which is, that puts you in the top 10%, 5% of the population, it'll often be hard to make ends meet with the 100K. And just the cost of living in major cities means that even if you're incredibly successful, it'll still be expensive to. So I don't think a lot of people who make 100K they could afford to have a stay-at-home wife and kids, which Homer Simpson back in the day could.
Right. It's so weird because, like, you know, I hear everyone say this and it seems to be true. Obviously, everyone feels it, that there's these massive economic problems, massive housing problems.
Yeah.
And I keep seeing people post these charts that show that, like, the share of wealth and is for like millennials, and I guess Gen Z is usually not on the chart yet, but for millennials is basically on track with the boomers and Gen Xers, and that the housing prices haven't really inflated that much beyond normal inflation. Like, what is it all just like BS? Like, what's happening?
It's incredibly easy to massage numbers if you want to. Yeah, that's just the best thing to say. And I mean, growing up in Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, I knew we had problems long before Trump. And I completely understand why people voted for Trump, because the Rust Belt is an area with a population larger than Germany, that's bigger than almost any country in Europe geographically. And the Rust Belt got completely hosed by deindustrialization, and no one cared until it wasn't even a topic of discussion until Trump showed up. And Trump was kind of an awakening, because beforehand you had this myth that liberalism would just bring us a utopia. And then we gradually realized that wasn't the case. And it's very easy to massage numbers by not looking at inflation, where one of my buddies runs statistical models for fun. And he found that we've actually entered a really harsh recession since COVID for most people. It's just we don't know how to. Inflation means we don't have to measure it. Because if you just look at inflation, the numbers are going up. But if you compare for cost of living, it's just horrible. Where the numbers are the worst in Canada, but I mean, rents have gone up some horrific amount over the last 2 or 3 years. In Canada, they've more than doubled, and I think it's a bit less than that in America. And the cost of chicken in Canada also went up like 50% or 100%. And so the prices of basic commodities have been going through the roof. But people will pick what metrics they want. Where, for example, GDP per capita has gone up a lot since the 1970s. That doesn't account for price inflation, which has gone up a lot more, and especially price inflation for certain necessary things like health or housing. Like, if you just look at housing inflation, your average lower class American puts 3/4 of their income into the housing market. And so if you index price inflation over everything except housing, you're just not going to account for how much housing is killing people.
Right. Let me see. Let me see some questions in the super chat.
Yeah, I hearted a bunch of them if you want. What's that?
You guys doing this live?
We are, yeah.
Sick.
Do you?
Oh, did you?
Yeah, of
Did you
course.
not know?
You thought we were recording?
My assumption was I talked the same
Look, the
way
chat,
for a while.
the chat's in love with you anyway, so it's not like you're not getting a bunch of. And there's a bunch of super chat questions and stuff like that. We never talked about how long you want to stick around. We've been talking for about an hour and 40 minutes, but I mean, this has been a great conversation. Obviously,
I'm having a lot of fun. I'm down to for another hour.
Okay, cool.
Okay. I just got to run to the bathroom first before we do this.
Yeah,
sure. Go to the bathroom.
Go ahead. We'll read a couple super chats that aren't aimed
You guys
at
can
you.
gossip about me when I'm gone.
We will.
Definitely.
Okay. PC, thanks so much for the 10 gifted memberships, PC.
Yeah.
I'll ask him about the Taiwan thing, so I'll say that.
We got
generic-
10 gifted memberships. Mark Twain's Revenge gifted 20 memberships,
Thank
which
you, Mark
is
Twain.
awesome. We got a 50 gifted memberships here somewhere.
Yeah, I saw Grendel Levat gave us 50 gifted memberships. Thanks so much, Grendel.
Yeah, cool.
Really
So
generous, yeah.
awesome. And I think Lucy Lemonbug gifted 5 as well.
Yes,
so.
thank you, Lucy. Despite being a dirty chopper.
Welcome new members.
By chopper, I mean sticker.
Right.
Generic
we mean
7.
Chopper.
Generic
Not
7.
gonna get me
Eric
again.
For 14 months says late and not gay. S class is S team.
We were pretty close to being on time this time.
We were
running a little
only
bit late
like
today,
10 minutes
so.
late. Yeah.
Everyone, look, Fast Times at Ridgemont High came up, and Fast Times at Ridgemont High was really big when I was like 12 years old. Me and my buddy, we went and snuck into the movie theater to see it. You can't see R-rated movies when you're 12.
Of course.
Yeah. Different time back then, so.
Yeah, it is funny because I am curious now to go back and watch that. Well, I wish I don't know what school's like for Zoomers. I have no clue what it's like. It's got to be so alien to what I would experience. And I'm sure it's even more alien than what you experience.
Look, part of me would go back in a hot second to actually live through it with all the technology and stuff. Because, I mean, my childhood was, I wanted to make movies so bad, but they didn't have any way for me to satiate that appetite. Yeah.
Right.
So if I went back again, like, I feel like I'd have a shot at having a film career. Like, I'd be like, I would have started making movies when I was 10.
Yeah, but they'd all be terrible, and you'd be competing with 1,000 million other people doing the same thing. So I don't know if it'd be like easier, but you'd feel better because you'd be doing something about it, right?
Maybe. I mean, maybe. It is an interesting dilemma, though. I do. There are obvious problems that young people face, and there are obvious problems that people faced when they didn't have these kind of technologies. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. Born Cell for 8 months says Historia Civilis is a YouTube history channel. Does a video in ancient Rome. His latest video titled "Work." He goes on a socialist rant. If you gave it a look, yeah, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but I don't think we're gonna do like a whole breakdown on the stream or anything. at any point.
Question does the chat have?
Okay. Well, someone talked about Philip Coggins brought up we're talking about subs operating the Taiwan Strait. He said the waters are extremely shallow and subs can be seen from the air while submerged. So I know you're talking.
I also don't know why submarine warfare would be useful for that. Submarines tend to operate over large geographic areas where you want to disrupt the enemy's movements. I think the Chinese's biggest advantage for that is just that they've murks the hell out of the coastline there, where the Chinese have been constructing bunkers with rockets for the last 60 years, and they've completely dominated that. And so I've heard that. I think the Chinese military is actually pretty bad. I stand by that. And so I don't know how effective they'd be, but they have the theoretic potential to deny any American ships in the Taiwan Strait. And I don't think submarines would be that strategically useful.
Do you think
go ahead.
What were you gonna say, Adam?
Well, I hearted the ones that are direct
yeah.
questions to him just to help you
Why
out,
not?
but go ahead.
But do you think that China would have a good chance at taking over Taiwan? It would be like Russia, Ukraine.
It's funny where it could go either way, and I don't know, but it's basically impossible to find a country with a good civilian bureaucracy and a bad military, or vice versa, where you can use your nation's ability to just get crap done inside itself through bureaucracy to its military. And so I think the Chinese would do really poorly because they have no background. They haven't fought a war since 1971, and then they failed in that war and the war before. But you look at the Chinese endeavors to do everything else, whether saving up food and iron and stuff for their potential problems, through dealing with COVID, through their lockdowns. And the Chinese have just been behaving in a very schizophrenic, poorly managed, just bad way. And so I think their military would probably be similar, because this is actually interesting, where all of China's previous invasions since like the last 500 years have failed for the same reason. The Chinese get a bunch of guys, they launch them forward, and then they don't train them, they don't do logistics right, and then they just get slaughtered by a much smaller native population. And this happened in Burma in the 18th century. It happened in Mongolia in the 1500s. It happened with Korea in the 1950s. And so I think that would be what would happen, where the Chinese would just not get the logistics right, have a bunch of guys die. And also, the thing with Taiwan is it's a fortress island where the cliffs are 1,000 miles, there's not 1,000, 1,000 feet tall, and it's jungle. And so amphibious invasions are incredibly difficult to pull off. And only the most advanced militaries in the world can do it. And so part of me thinks, like, China is the geographic size of the United States and is 4 times the population. And Taiwan's the size of Ireland. So imagine if there was like an Ireland off the coast of South Carolina and the U.S. failed to conquer that.
Embarrassing.
That would be pretty embarrassing. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially because, China does have an air force and stuff like that. So
they do.
They don't have to scale those walls, right? They just fly over there.
Air Force doesn't really do much. I mean, if you look over history, you've never been able to use an Air Force to win an on-the-ground conflict where, the Vietnam War is the greatest example. The U.S. dropped more just bombs on North Vietnam, which was a third world pre-industrial society, than the entirety of World War II combined. And we didn't do a dent in the Vietnamese.
Because they have trouble dropping a bunch of people in there. Paratroopers are bad because there's no supply line.
There's not enough of them. It's just you can't launch an offensive campaign like that. And also, like, if you just drop infantry, they'll get slaughtered by tanks.
Right.
And one of the things I've learned reading enough history is humans can be like cockroaches, where you can besiege a city for years, drop bombs in it every single day, every hour, and then somehow like 40% of the population survives. This is one of the things from World War I, where in World War I, they drop ungodly amounts of artillery on like a single mile of area for a week, and then somehow a majority of the people survive.
Look, because you figure it out. You're like, look, I need a bunker quick. You're digging a hole and putting cement on the top of it.
And when shit hits the fan, people will really struggle hard to survive.
Yeah.
Thas Apprentice, thanks so much for 6 months. Says, I don't agree with everything Rudyard says, but I appreciate his historical analysis even as a lefty. P.S. Rags mentioned Lion King 1.5. Did you DM him? I did not. No.
Thank you. Was there a question there?
There wasn't, no.
Just a compliment.
Nax last for 18 months says, I'm very interested in hearing about how the far left are invested in purity. I would have thought they didn't tolerate dissent, not impurity.
Okay, yeah. So purity, according to John Haidt, is what values do you hold sacred? And it's very closely related to disgust, where if someone's very high in disgust, they'll also be very high in purity. Where, for example, with a woke person, they wouldn't want to go on a camping trip where they'd have to see their friends naked and go through dirt and all that stuff in the same way like a religious fundamentalist wouldn't be comfortable with that. Or they wouldn't. People who are high in purity also don't like taking rotting food out of the fridge.
Right.
It's the same psychological, physiological force. And we don't notice. Every society has to have purity to differing degrees. And too much, it becomes like a strangling force, and too little, you fall into decadence. And we don't notice the far left's purity because it's not in normal ways. If you're part of a traditional religion, you would have purity associated with sex or with not taking the Lord's name in vain, or for following the right rituals. For the left, it relates to word usage and language, where, for example, as a person who's basically a libertarian, if I ran an organization and a communist came to speak, I wouldn't have a problem with that. If you're on the far left and Jordan Peterson speaks in your college, he is defiling the purity of the organization with his alternate views. Mm-hmm. If you're on the left, and this is why they get triggered so easily, because their purity threshold is so unbelievably high, or so unbelievably low, where, like for me, I get called all the most horrible things every day on YouTube, but it's part of the job. If for the left, their purity comes through basically extreme emotional reactions to things that will not endanger their lives.
Has Height redone his moral foundations test on woke people? Because I know, like, classically, okay, because I know, like,
pre-woke done that stuff for the coddling of the American mind, where because when Height was writing that in like probably 2016, I guess, when he wrote The Righteous Mind. Wokeness
2012 was Righteous Mind.
Okay.
See, I did change my life. I was like, holy cow.
Yeah.
Thanks again, friend. I told you I'd make it worth your while.
I mean, it's funny where I've got some like hippie-like tendencies. I have a collection of hippie shirts. Like, I'm interested in the spirit world, and I can get kind of woo-woo at times, where that would be a very left-wing trait 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And now on the left, like you see a lot of people like Joe Rogan or Russell Brand. If those people are on the right, that means the left has gotten very stringent and very fundamentalist. And it's funny to see that switch occur. Because back in the day, if you lived in Portland, Oregon, you would be able to live whatever life you wanted, and people wouldn't judge you. And now, if you want to do that, you move to a red state. And so you've seen the purity axes flip, where the left took on a lot of traits that you used to just see in religious fanatics.
Yeah, because I know, like, classically, the left had very little care for purity at all in his original stuff. So I'm wondering if, like, what we're seeing with woke, is it really a disgust that's manifesting, or is it something different? It's just this dissent that's not being tolerated.
The left offers. I know a lot of people who are incredibly woke, and I know it's on a visceral biological level, because if something bad happens, they'll burst into tears or they'll ruin their week, and that's not something you fake. And the left kind of just offers. It tells people whatever they want to hear to get power. And you see with communism, offer utopia. The second they do get power, they enslave the populace and kill millions of people.
Right.
And I'm going to quote the Unabomber here, because I think he has got the correct analysis, that the left is a reaction to how atomizing and alienating modernity is. Because back in the day, you'd live in a village, everyone in the village knew you, you may have had a hard life, but at least you felt like you were a person, and you had your own little plot of land that you managed as a business with your wife. And now you work at a giant mega corporation. And if you look at the left's top demographics, and what Kaczynski, the Unabomber, said was that this caused a lot of feelings of repression and alienation, because if you're dealing with all these personal bureaucracies, you're not allowed to express who you are as an individual. But if you're in a village where everyone knows you since childhood, you can be yourself. And if you look at the left, their dominant things they talk about are repression, powerlessness, and resentment. And that would make sense for a bunch of people who feel like they're cogs in the machine. And what you would also see with a worldview built off that is a anger at standards and controlling yourself. So they would offer everything, and then once they get power, they turn it into basically an ego trip where they get total power over everything. And the left is powered off everyone wanting to be the dictator with total power, which is why they don't structure. The left doesn't have any structures for once it gets into power because everyone wants to be the dictator.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, though I do think, especially kind of like with Uncle Ted and stuff of that nature, there's a lot of grass is greener going on there. Because, like, if you live in a small town and everyone knows you, or a small village, everyone knows you, that can be just as stifling, because then it's like the authenticity of the individual can completely be annihilated because everything becomes like, well, everyone knows who you are. You have no anonymity to do anything. Everything you do is a reflection of your family. Everything becomes very much, you know, about the family name and everything. So it's like a different type of stifling of your individuality.
I mean, I agree with you that I agree with Uncle Ted. I'm allowed to say that. I agree with the Unabombers.
Uncle Ted now? You guys are calling him? What are you, crazy?
I agree.
I do not support the Unabomber in any fashion.
Yeah, I also do not support the Unabomber in any fashion. But
the Luddite challenge, I mean, is pretty interesting, but go ahead.
His assessment of the problems with modernity is correct. I think his idea we need to revert to monkey is wrong, because it's you can't go back. Like, the advantages conferred by industrialization are so massive, and people tend to go to conclusions, and I jump to radical conclusions. And I think realistically, you can warp modernity over time to not have the problems he talks about. And what I'd say is that what you're describing is incredibly collectivist, and it's stifling. But it lasted for thousands of years, and our system's falling apart after a century. And the West, and especially the English-speaking countries, are able to break out of that, where if you're in 1600s England or early America, you live in this very rural, personal society, but also you've broken down the clan and you have capitalism. So you would know the people in your life, but also there is an expectation you'd move out of your town and have social mobility. And I've said in loads of videos that the breakdown of the clan and the rise of individualism is the biggest thing that resulted in the West's dominance and later stuff like the Industrial Revolution or the Scientific Revolution or the modern world.
Yeah, I just think it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, where we're talking about like the medieval period is like this massive period, and history goes through this kind of ebb and flow of people being in a good spot and then people being in a bad spot under similar systems, similar economic systems, similar cultural systems. And I feel like, I mean, everyone kind of does this. Like, they'll just, sample bias, point to all the good parts of some system they like, ignore all the bad parts, and say, see, everyone was happier back then. And I'm always just eternally skeptical. I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's lots of horrible stuff going on back then.
I try really hard to not glorify the past because it was hard. And I live in Texas right now, and I would not live here even 100 years ago because of malaria and the heat.
And AC, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, if I wanted to, I could grab a flight to Paris tonight. That's insane. I could be there tomorrow morning. And so we have a lot to be thankful for. And I kind of view history as cycling between tolerable and intolerable, where when I went to high school, I was like, I didn't have any spending money. I was working really hard, but my life felt tolerable. I had a lot of friends. I was happy. And objectively, I might live you could be objectively a millionaire with a beautiful wife who's famous, but your life is intolerable for other reasons. And I don't care what those other reasons are. What matters is that it's intolerable to you. You could be a peasant in northern India and you're happy because you just like your life a lot. And history goes through these cycles of tolerable and intolerable. And when things get and it's for a bunch of reasons, whether economic, family, just you have a lot of freedom, and it doesn't really matter what the reasons are. What matters is the outcome of, are people happy? And we're in a system where we may have a lot of material advances, but our society is falling apart due to mental health issues. And so I judge we have a lot going for us, but we're intolerable in the same way that like Europe before the Black Death was intolerable, or Rome before it fell was intolerable.
Right.
It seems like throughout history there have been times where there's been societal collapse, like societies that just cease to exist. I don't know if that can possibly happen now that the world is so interconnected, because
it makes it easier, actually.
Okay,
There's a thing called complexity theory, and it stems from the study of the Bronze Age collapse, where most people have never heard of it, but the Bronze Age collapse was something that happened around 3,000 years ago, where over a matter of 50 years, the entire Bronze Age world fell apart.
Did they lose technology? What happened? What did it look like?
We don't really know. Like, all the smartest people have tried to study this. We don't have a good answer. And it could be barbarian invasion, climate change, social change. The best answer I would have is that the Bronze Age, and we invented complexity theory as an outgrowth. It's funny that we don't think about it because it was 3,000 years ago, but the Bronze Age world was incredibly globalized and was dependent upon getting resources from really far away. And so you would get tin shipped into the Middle East to make bronze from the British Isles or from Afghanistan. And the tin trade and all these exotic resources was spanning the entire world 3,000 years ago. And so what ended up happening was that once you knocked out one part of the trade node, everything else fell apart. So once barbarians knock out the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, the entire rest of the Bronze Age world collapsed. And also, there was a technological shift where the governments of that era were really repressive, and there was a shift away from basically a democratization of weapons. And so the peasants were thinking to themselves, why do we need the government anymore? They just tax us. And so it was a breakdown in people feeling like they needed government. And with globalization, I don't know if we'll have a social breakdown. We're a pretty advanced society, but we're in a similar place where there are so many interconnected pieces. And this is something I really admire Peter Zeihan's research. Where did you know that the third world is completely dependent upon grain from Russia and Ukraine? So if those countries have a civil war, hundreds of millions of people will starve in Africa and the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Or we're dependent upon the chips in our phone are mined in the Congo, one of the most unstable areas. And then the chips, the subcomponents for the chips, and the chips themselves can only be made in Taiwan, also a really strategically weird area, or oil. And so if Peter Zeihan talks that if one node of global trade falls out, the system collapses. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but it's definitely possible.
We'll find out. Wolfie for $10 says, hello, Alt Hiss, been watching your videos for many years now. Very good videos with a breadth of good information.
Where can I send you today, adventurer?
I mean this in no
Many are
offensive
the
way, but you
paths of
speak
the
like you're
Earth
always giving a presentation.
Maybe I am. Maybe that's just what my subconscious is.
There you go.
Video essays are kind of a presentation anyway. So.
Of course.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Do you have a take on the idea that one day robots or AI will actually displace humanity?
So AI is not my area of speciality, and I'm very careful to not walk into areas that I haven't studied super hard, because having looked into history really deeply, the difference in your comprehension of everything between on one side of the Dunning-Kruger is massive. And so I know, like, for climate change or AI, I'm in a position where I don't know what's going on. What I'd say is I think that if AI got too bad, we just have a revolution, because the end point of AI is massively increasing inequality. And so if we increase inequality more, I think we'd have a revolution. And I also think I think for a lot of people, AI is the revelation for nerds, where the singularity or history ends. I think that's foolish. And people are always want to say the world's ending, and it never does.
Right.
But on top of that, I also think AI is incapable of doing everything we think it is due to a philosophic bug in modernity, where AI can't interact with the real world. Its information is purely based off the data sets we give it. and off the assumption that's going to producing it. And so in the same way, every side of the political spectrum went through a phase of saying that they were the scientific truth. Once we make AIs, I think that they'll just become reflections of the worldviews of the people that make them. And they won't be able to like tell us, is there a God? Or how do I live a happy life? Or how do I run the economy? Or how do I win wars? I don't think they'll be capable of operating on that level. I have a friend, I think what they can do, I'll use an example. I have a friend that uses AI to look at people's faces and then determine how their personalities and looking at their body language and use that to determine how their personalities work. Because there's data on people's personalities compared to their body language that you can.
Hail. I see the nasty tribe of Razorfen Crowl now knows the pain of my people. Serves the foul beasts right. To drive one from a holy land is a sin, worthy of the most severe revenge. Thank you, adventurer, for aiding me in my plight.
Can do that, and it's scarily accurate. And I mean, Turchin also used AI to figure out when societies have civil wars. And so the top thing AI would do would be to wipe out a class of white collar workers, which they kind of run society. So I'd imagine that they'd react poorly to that. And it would also, I could also, as a positive, see it speeding up research really quickly.
Do you think that we will, like, just philosophically, is it possible to create an artificial human, like a robot that is sentient?
I don't think so. I think it's too complicated, because if we've learned anything from science, it's that everything is much, much more complicated than we give it credit for. And what we've found in every field of science is once you get past a certain length, it's just chaos you can't predict. The subconscious past a certain point is chaos. Physics past a certain point is chaos. History past a certain point is chaos. And we've studied physics, and we can't predict where particles go. And so I think we would never be able to recreate the human race with robots, because too many factors that just went into the creation of us can't be replicated in the lab.
Do you understand the Chat GPT technology? Have you looked into that at all?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so Chat GPT basically takes these large language data sets, and it's only trying to predict the next best guess for what word goes next. So it's a completely different way of thinking. And ever since I figured out how it worked, I start thinking about my own thinking and wondering how close it is to actual human thought. Like, are humans thinking in these large blocks of concepts, or are most humans just thinking what next logical word goes here?
I think people's subconsciouses are infinitely deep, and things are going on in multiple calculations at the same time. And people have different personalities inside of them that are jockeying for influence. And so,
well, the reason that I bring it up is just because of the complexity thing. If there's two ways that it could go, either humans are far more complicated than Chat GPT, or they're as simple as Chat GPT, and we just have this idea that it's complicated, but really it's just
I think
very
humans
simple
are
idea.
It's like Andrew Jackson had a character.
Such as already rebelling at the idea.
I think humans are way more complicated than ChatGPT. I mean,
well, maybe just obviously humans have two different operating systems here. They have they have the emotional, and then they have the logical, rational language part of the brain built on top of that. Maybe just a language part of the brain works like ChatGPT. But ChatGPT obviously doesn't have all of the emotional.
I think well, first of all, defining what sentience is very complicated in the first place. Like, how do you define when a robot has gained sentience in the first place? I don't even, because I think it's possible that we could create. I think it's possible we could create, data or something like that at some point. but you would never really know, is this something that's sentient and has consciousness and deserves rights? Or is it something that's simply just acting the way that we've programmed it to act, and it's really just a toaster that looks like nice and says nice things? I don't think we'll ever be able to really make that determination.
We have
I don't know
to,
how we
though.
could.
We're going to have to as a society.
We're going to have to, but I don't know how we can. Like, I don't think we can replicate humans, but I think we can make something like a data in the future.
Go ahead, Roger.
It's much easier to replicate the external forms of things than the internal ones.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, like, it makes me think of Andrew Jackson had a parrot that would speak full sentences, and the parrot had no clue what it was doing.
Give that parrot rights. I mean, I'm for it.
Mounted on the back of a...
But what I've found with my study of anthropology is people are much more deeper and irrational than we have any comprehension of. And people also think in very different ways, where men and women think differently, people of different cultures think differently. Just random people, I'm sure all of us, if you did a Myers-Briggs, we'd come out different. And that informs our life in a bunch of ways. And I think AI will become a reflection of the California data nerds who built it rather than the human race. And we'll end up seeing, it will be useful for a couple things, but it will be there's a theory that consciousness is dependent upon individuality, or your existence, because you can't think about something unless you're in a certain space where you have to grow up and experience the world, because once you think about something, you're thinking how to get something and how to live your life. And that's dependent upon having an actual life. And so I've heard it's impossible for a computer to be able to think in the same way as a human, because life is so wildly different from a human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this is how they're training the various robots, because they're training them on data sets. It's just real world interaction between the robot and whatever task.
Yeah, but what's motivating the robot and guiding the robot is so vastly different than what motivates and guides a human.
Because, I mean,
is it?
Of course.
Let's be real. The motivation for guys to dress well is 70% getting laid.
Yes, that's look. You're making my point here.
Robots aren't trying to get laid.
Look, they tell the robot, get the soccer ball in the.
And look at what happens 5 years down the road.
Yeah,
men will be living in absolute filth. You just remove the incentive structure, and your entire society changes.
Yeah.
The robot doesn't have the incentive to get laid or be liked or find.
Why not? You just program it in.
I don't know what to tell you.
You're like, there's women here. Look, get dates with these women.
Hello, I am Omnitron 3000. You are Stacy number 3112. What would you like for dinner?
Look.
Pick
you
up
know,
320.
You know that robot would be getting a date 7 nights a week, like in just a matter of time.
I mean, what's it look like? Anyway, let's move on from the robots. Luke W. for 4 months says, if any of the stuff is real regarding CIA spirit world stuff, how come nobody has been able to claim the James Randi $1 Million Challenge?
What is that?
That's a good point.
So James Randi was a famous skeptic and magician, I believe, who he basically supposedly offered $1 million to any psychic that could prove that they were psychic through some scientific rigor or something.
This is one of those things that gets kind of weird, but we've had physics experiments where literally particles move differently whether or not you're looking at them.
Right.
And that sounds fake, but it's actually true, where we've run it where if you have a camera looking at something, particles move differently than if it's not. And that strangely corresponds to the ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy that thought they believed that consciousness created reality,
right?
Which I don't know how to explain that, but and it's one of those things where, again, I'm throwing out theories I don't know if are true or not, but there are certain things that can't be measured, and they can't be measured scientifically, like love. Love happens. If we were in a certain autistic enough society, we could say that love didn't exist because we didn't replicate it under scientific conditions.
You know, Podzik was one of the most respected tinkerers in Undermine before he retired to start working on the racers. The first thing he did when he joined the team was develop the 2-engine model racers. Could be that the businesses will suffer without him working with the Tinkers Union, but who cares, right? There's nothing like the races. Back to what you came here about. I know I promised Podzik that I'd deliver a new fuel regulator for him, but I still haven't received it yet. Revelgaz over in Booty Bay said he'd have it shipped over, but it might be it slipped through the cracks somehow. If that's true, there's not much we can do about it. We can at least find out if it was dispatched from Booty Bay. Check in with Wharfmaster Losgill over there. He should be able to check the cargo records. Oh yes, parts for Cravel. I'm glad you're here. These things have been sitting out here for days, and I was afraid they'd rust. Here's Cravel's package, adventurer, and when you deliver it, tell him if he wants more special orders, then he'll have to pay his tab.
Or
experience it. That's the only way to know. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Or, for example, we do this a lot with my field, where people say we will never have a major war or political crisis because the West hasn't had one since 1950. And I'm thinking, you're using like a bad scientific model where since 1950 is your scientific study, and then everything outside of that doesn't exist. And I'm not sure that that's the correct way. Because imagine you are a psychic and you say that someone you love will have a problem in the next month, and then your grandmother realizes she has cancer 2 weeks later. How do you measure that?
Right. Do you know about the Baxter experiments with the?
No, I don't.
With the plants and the lie detectors.
Oh no! Please tell.
There's like, this is so frustrating. There's a guy who basically created the lie detector on a whim. He hooked up the lie detectors to I forget what kind of plant it was, some plants, and he thought like, oh, I'm going to water these plants, and maybe the lie detector will like measure the electroactivity of the water like going up the stem of the plant. And the thing that he noticed was really weird was that before he started to water the plant, like as he's like leaning in to do it, it started registering on the lie detector. And then he started to think, oh, like maybe the plants have some way of detecting when moisture is near or something, like it's preparing. Yeah. But then it was even weird. So then he started doing stuff where he would he wouldn't actually have water. He would just visualize in his mind that he was going to water the plant. And apparently that would register on the plant. And then he would also say like, oh, well, I'm going to like attack the plant with fire or something. And then that would register on the plant. And then he'd just think about attacking the plant with fire. And that would, and he'd always like really wacky experiments to just see what the plants would react to this. And I'm reading this, I'm like, how has this not been like either debunked by like people replicating this and failing to get the results, or or saying that it's true? And there's actually, it's hilarious, there was a Mythbusters where they tried to replicate this and they actually did. And they still like said like, oh,
no way.
Like, yeah, well, it's funny because they're like, oh, well, we replicated it. We were like attacking the plants, thinking about attacking the plants, and it registered. However, after a time of thinking about attacking the plants, it stopped registering. Therefore, it's not scientifically valid, or it's not repeatable, so it's not science. Even though that was literally part of Baxter's experiment, was he would say, oh, if I kept threatening them in my mind but not going through with it, they'd stop registering it. And so I don't understand like why people aren't trying to replicate these experiments.
The philosophic jumps I've made that I'm shocked few other people have is I've come to the conclusion that human societies and everything is alive. When I look at a country, I see a country as a living, breathing organism. And I see history as a living process because everyone involved is living. And I see countries take on a lot of the psychological aspects of individuals. Like countries can go crazy like individuals, like if they're happy phases. And a lot of our problems in modernity stem from us treating things that are living as if they're machines. Where I remember when I went to school, I would wake up at 5:30 every morning to go to school. And that made sense for their autistic bus schedule, but what you're actually doing is creating a miserable experience where the kids don't learn. And so we treat people like they're cogs rather than individuals. And with that, it makes sense from a living person's perspective, where if I hear a giant T-Rex roar outside my house, I will be scared until it happens 5 times over. My neighbors tell me it's just a boombox and I shouldn't be afraid, then I'll stop being scared, because living things interact with their environments. And so once the plants realize they're not going to be threatened, it stops being a scary thing.
Right.
And I mean, the reason beforehand is that no one has an incentive to push it. Traditional religious authorities, they would lose a lot of their power if you had to open up a whole new can of worms. Academia bases its power off a materialist world. Government authorities, like I read an interesting book, The Secular Age by Charles Taylor, And he made two really interesting points. I mean, there's the obvious point that religion went into decline due to technological progress, but he also said that religion went into decline because religious authorities became buzzkills, and it was also easier for national governments to control their populations without religion because you could just make it straight. Nationalism is your new religion.
Have you read Donald Hoffman? Do you know about his research? No. Oh, you got to check him out. We'll have to exchange a bunch of book ideas after the stream. Yeah.
Jay for $20 says the right has the military. He must not be talking about the U.S. military. Yeah, people say the military is woke now.
It's different things. So that this actually happened in the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution. Enlisted men and the officers tilt right. Most of the left are ethnic minorities inside the military who are not woke. And then the government makes political appointments for the highest level of the military. And I have some friends who are attached to that, and they're actually using Me Too, they're using Me Too to basically remove the top brass level of the military, even if it doesn't make any sense. And what's happened in the French Revolution and the Russian Civil War was that when shit hits the fan, men side with their colonels and their officers rather than the admirals or generals, because they see those men as identifiable to them, while they see the top level brass as political appointments.
True. And Jay for another $20. Thank you, Jay. Says, quote, the left baits the right into doing something stupid. Christian nationalism has entered the chat. Yeah, that's James Lindsay's perspective, and I definitely could see that happening.
Yeah, I just wish the right would cool it for a couple of years until, I've in so many videos I've told the right not to launch a revolution because that's the only way.
Yeah.
No one's driving the ship though. I feel like it's gonna.
That's the problem. The mob psychology is the worst aspects of individual psychology.
Yep.
Yeah, and it always presents itself at the worst possible time.
Yeah, there's a mob, and then there's the people that basically rise to the top by just listening to the mob and giving them whatever they want to hear.
Ibram Kendi is not a real intellectual. The reason he's worth $50 million is he gave the mob what he wanted. And Donald Trump, our glorious God Emperor, he's like, I don't see him as a realpolitik, political mastermind. He's giving the crowd what it wants. And you look at this last election, he didn't launch a revolution, but he said a lot of stuff that was proxy to it. And I do wonder if stuff gets worse, especially if he gets indicted. Does he just YOLO it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we were talking about Civil War stuff, and I mean, you were talking about this on a previous stream, Adam. I do think something that would lead us down a bad pathway is that if Trump gets elected and he